Chapter 2006. Zhang Yan calculated in his heart. If he only cared about the situation in Busu Tian, with his current power, he only needed to maintain this advantage. Then there would be nothing to worry about. It was just that there was still an external force here. Although that existence's true power couldn't seep in, it could change the fate of the heavens. Just like just now, it could clearly calculate the true master, but in the end, it had to go through a lot more trouble. As the arrival of that existence got closer, it was hard to guarantee that it would not attract more. After all, Busu Tian's Weili was limitless, and logically speaking, anything could happen. Under such a pincer attack, it was hard to say that the situation would not be reversed. Thus, he could not be careless until the final outcome was decided. Next, he had to hurry up and eliminate the foreign forces that did not want to deal with him. Speaking of which, those chaotic heavens were half free and half attached to Busu Tian. When the day came that he controlled Busu Tian, he might be able to see many of its secrets. Just as he was calculating, he suddenly found that in the next 100 years, the disciples of the sect would gradually return to their seats. This situation was not a coincidence, but a premonition before a great disaster. What made him vigilant was that if his consciousness had not been focused on Busu Tian, he might have overlooked this. Because of this premonition, after he ordered Jiang Zheng to retreat, he immediately began to calculate the location of the true master. Not long after, his gaze passed through the layers of barriers and saw an indescribable fog of light. This was the true existence known as the Heavenly Saint. This person had the power of a true young cultivator, but this Weili did not fall in the present, but in the future. This thing was formed from the spiritual essence of the world, and if one obtained it, there was a high chance of becoming a true young cultivator. After the consciousness of that existence shone in, the shadow of its future was stimulated and gradually transmitted its Weili to the myriad worlds of Busu Tian, causing everything to lean towards itself. Because the difference in power between ordinary people and lower realm cultivators was too great, there was no barrier between illusion and reality. In the eyes of Zhang Yan, all of this was just an illusion, so the moment he saw it, all of the future disappeared, returning to the most primitive source of power, and then slowly disappeared under his gaze. Zhang Yan shook his head. After all, this was a forced reflection of the future, and this power was extremely illusory. If it was a true young almighty being, he would be able to easily erase it, but he would definitely not lose what belonged to him. In reality, if a spirit refinement almighty being was willing to help promote a disciple to the true young realm, it was not impossible. However, if the level of the promoted living being was too low, it would not be able to maintain this power on its own and would soon collapse on its own, unless there was an almighty being willing to help maintain it from time to time. But whether it was true young or mortal shedding, they were all ordinary to a spirit refinement cultivator, so no one would do such a thing. After Zhang Yan eliminated the source of the chaos, he only felt that Busu Tian's Weili was closer to him, and he could clearly sense the existence of some strange power. This time, he could try to sweep it clean in one go, so with a thought, he pushed his endless Fa-Li to those places. Time passed, and in a flash, 20 years had passed in the Kunshe continent. In the Zhaoyuan Cyprus country, at the foot of Mount Jia, there was a village of more than 300 people. In an ordinary farmer's house, a strong man was anxiously pacing back and forth outside the house. There were bursts of painful sounds coming from inside, accompanied by the shouts of the midwife. After a long time, the sound finally stopped. Just as he was at a loss of what to do, a loud and clear cry suddenly rang out. Then, a strong sense of joy exploded in his heart. Son, it must be a son. But what he didn't know at the moment was that this cry was heard by almost everyone in the village. And at this moment, the animals in the village became extremely quiet, no one dared to make a sound. At the same time, colorful birds flew over and landed on the house, gently combing their feathers. When a villager saw this phenomenon, he immediately reported it to the village chief. When the village chief heard this, he laughed and said, "This is a good omen, looks like Chang Dalong's child is born extraordinary." In the land of the Kunshe continent, because of the unlimited spiritual opportunity, even among the ordinary people, there would often be divine manifestations among newborn children. Although this village chief had not seen it, he had heard of many. For example, there was a child in the neighboring village who was born with extraordinary strength. No matter what it was, he could easily crush it in his hands. When he was 5 years old, he could already fight lions and tigers, and even ordinary monsters. Now, he was taken away by a minister of the country. Thinking that there was also such a person in his village who was blessed by the heavens, he was very happy and said, "Let's go take a look." Jia village was a small village, nothing could be hidden. The villagers were curious, and when the village chief moved, they also squeezed over to watch the show. When Chang Dalong heard that the village chief had arrived, he hurriedly came out to welcome him. The village chief congratulated him a few times and stepped into the courtyard. Just now, when he came in, he saw a group of squirrels running in. Chang Dalong wanted to chase them away, but unexpectedly, the squirrels stood up and bowed to him. The village chief's heart moved, but he stopped him. What happened next surprised everyone. The squirrels put down the pine cones in their mouths, then went out to bring in another one. With their hard work, the courtyard was soon filled with a pile of pine cones. The village chief laughed and pointed, "Chang Dalong, this is a congratulatory gift for your family. Looks like you're not an ordinary child." Chang Dalong touched the back of his head and revealed a simple and honest smile. At this moment, the sound of flapping wings suddenly came from the sky. The villagers looked towards the sound and saw two birds that were half black and half white, their tail feathers like ribbons, standing on the eaves. A sharp-eyed person immediately shouted happily, "Heaven swallow, it's heaven swallow." The heaven swallow was not big, but it was a kind bird, a lucky bird. If it lived on top of a house, then it could protect the safety of the family. Even if the child was in danger, it would cry out. Also, this bird specialized in eating poisonous insects and some grassworms in the fields, so it wasn't just one family that benefited, but the entire village. It was no wonder that the villagers were so happy. The village chief chuckled. He didn't expect that Chang Dalong's son would bring benefits to the village the moment he was born. At this moment, he suddenly felt something and looked towards the corner. He saw a creature that looked like a cat or a dog quietly squatting there. Its whole body was green, it looked small and exquisite, and its eyes were very lively. He trembled and cried out, "Green grasshopper?" The green grasshopper could prey on snakes and rats, and also had the ability to ward off evil and guard the house. With it here, evil spirits and ghosts couldn't come near, so this creature was worshipped as a family deity in remote places. At this moment, the village chief wasn't just shocked, his heart was shaken. One vision was still fine, but the simultaneous appearance of more than one meant that Chang Dalong's son was very extraordinary. He looked at the baby that was carried out by the midwife and sighed, "You little boy, you're amazing, amazing." At Chang Dalong's request, he named the child Zai on the spot and concluded, "Don't look at how your son has just been born. Who knows, we might have to rely on him in the future." In the blink of an eye, 4 years had passed. Chang Zai was now 4 years old, but he already had the size of a 7 or 8-year-old child. His intelligence also grew very quickly. As he gradually grew up, more visions appeared. As long as he walked to the river, there would be schools of fish following him. Sometimes, they would even jump onto the shore and let him catch them. When he slept in the wilderness, there would be birds with big leaves to cover him, and there would be tigers and wolves catching small beasts to satisfy his hunger. However, at this time, there were really many strange people in the world. The villagers had seen many of them, and as time passed, they got used to it. If there were no accidents, he might grow up to be an adult. Just now, he would leave the village and wander outside. Until one day, when the village worshipped the god of Mount Jia, Chang Zai followed his parents and kowtowed. However, when he kowtowed, the shrine shook and almost broke. That night, the god of Mount Jia appeared in his dream and said that there was a noble in the village, and he couldn't accept his great bow. Even though the god didn't say who it was, the villagers could more or less guess who it was. The village chief specially came to Chang Dalong's house and said, "Dalong of the Chang family, you are born with visions. It's a pity to leave you in the village." Chang Dalong was an honest farmer and didn't know much. When the god appeared in his dream, he also guessed that it was his son. he didn't know what to do and asked, "What does the old village chief say?" The village chief said, "Zai has strange powers. Why don't we send him to the immortal palace to be a cup holder?" The immortal palace was actually established by the feudal vassals of the countries of human Dao. Because the gods of the heavens wouldn't participate in the internal conflicts of the feudal vassals, and these people were eager to pursue divine arts, they finally set their sights on the cultivators. To be more precise, it was the rogue cultivators. Due to the endless spiritual opportunities in Kunsher continent and the inexhaustible foreign resources, and with the extermination of many different species, the cultivators could set foot in more and more lands. As a result, the rogue cultivators who were the most down and out in the past started to prosper. The rogue cultivators didn't have their own race like the big sects, so the disciples could only go to the different species tribes or the countries of human Dao to find them. The immortal abode was established under such circumstances. The feudal vassal states would gather children who were born with visions within their borders, teach them words and etiquette, and wait for the cultivators to come and choose them. If a child was chosen by the cultivators, not only would they gain a favor, they could also receive a generous gift. Even the children who were old and not chosen could also serve the country in the future because they had strange powers. The rogue cultivators were also very satisfied with this. Originally, they needed to travel around and find suitable people to teach them. That was completely based on luck. But now that so many children were gathered together, they could always find someone who was compatible with them, saving them the time of searching personally. Of course, if one wanted to enter the immortal abode, they needed someone to recommend them. It wasn't easy to enter, and the village chief didn't have this ability. This time, he came because the god of Mount Jia had appeared in his dream and was willing to be the person to recommend them. That was why he dared to bring up this matter. Even though Chang Dalong was honest, he also knew that this was a rare opportunity. Even though he was reluctant, he still said, "Old village chief, I agree. Just tell me what you want me to do." The old village chief smiled and said, "There's no need for you to do anything. It's just that no matter how extraordinary you are, you're only 4 years old. The road isn't smooth and I'm old, my muscles and bones are already weak. I don't have the strength to travel, so I need you to personally send me to the capital." Then he patted Chang Dalong's shoulder and said, "If you and your son prosper in the future, don't leave our village behind." Chapter 2007. Chang Dalong prepared for a day and set off with Chang Zai. Originally, the village chief wanted to lend his donkey to the father and son. However, Chang Dalong was afraid that they would encounter some wild beasts on the way. If the donkey was eaten, he would not be able to afford it, so he did not ask for it. Originally, he wanted to take care of his son this time, but in the end he benefited a lot from his son. Not long after the father and son went out, 2 wild horses came over to be their mounts. Even without a saddle and bridle, they walked steadily. Most of the population of the Bai Kingdom was concentrated in the capital, and the rest of the land was mostly scattered villages. Jiashan village was one of the more remote villages, so they did not see a single person for more than half a day. Fortunately, every 100 miles, there were some sentry posts and beacons to let people know that they were still in the border of the Bai Kingdom. However, it was already early autumn, and this was not a strictly guarded place, so most of the soldiers in the original beacons had already removed their armors and returned. The soldiers who were supposed to be on duty had not yet arrived. The father and son stayed here at night. With Chang Zai here, even if there was no fire at night, there was no need to be afraid of wild beasts. On the first night, Chang Dalong found the footprints of wild wolves outside and was nervous for a while. However, Chang Zai told him that these wild wolves were here to protect him, so he was relieved. These years, he had a lot of faith in his son's ability. During the day, the two of them did not need to know the way at all, and let the horses go by themselves. Not only did they go smoothly, but they also avoided some dangerous places with monsters and evil spirits. As for food, there was no shortage. As long as there was a forest in the distance, there would be monkeys coming over to offer fruits. Sometimes, they would even bring a gourd of monkey wine. In this way, the originally difficult journey became comfortable. Because they avoided all the dangers, The father and son took a few more detours. It was not until half a month later that they arrived at the capital of the Bai Kingdom. The Immortal Palace was very easy to find. It was in the Qingtian court on the outskirts of the city. This place was vast, facing the lake, and behind it was the food mound. Sometimes, red-crowned cranes would circle here. Chang Delong found the Immortal Palace guard and handed over the recommendation letter. This book was given by the mountain god of Mount Jia. It was more useful than being recommended by the nobles. Although it was only a mountain god, it was still considered a god. Thus, the local officials did not dare to make things difficult for Chang Zai. They successfully sent Chang Zai to the Immortal Palace and added a stroke to the register. As for the National Register, it could be added later. When Chang Delong returned, the village chief said that he would take care of his family and asked him to take care of Chang Zai without worry. He was also afraid that his son would be bullied because of his young age. However, after a few days, he realized that he was worrying too much. Chang Zai's daily food and clothing were provided by the Immortal Palace, and the people of the Immortal Palace were all polite to children with strange powers. No one dared to do anything out of line. He had been out for so long and he missed home. Coincidentally, there were feng shui soldiers heading to Mount Jia, so they returned together. Soon more than 4 months had passed. Chang Zai sat on the stone steps of an abandoned palace, basking in the warm sunlight of the beginning of winter as he contentedly nibbled on a large piece of flatbread. On his shoulders stood an iron-tailed eagle. Compared to a few days ago, he seemed to have grown up a lot and was already about 10 years old. After so many days, he had already adapted to life here. Most of the children who could enter the Immortal Palace were born with strange powers like him. However, there were a few who were the children of the nobles. These people were placed here in hopes of being chosen by cultivators. Secondly, they wanted to build a good relationship with Chang Zai and the other children so that they could help them in the future. Since he was a child, Chang Zai had never lacked meat, but there had never been such fine flatbread in the village. He usually ate beans and corn, so he fell in love with it and ate a few pieces every day. At this moment, a voice was heard from afar. "Ha, Chang Zai, I knew you were hiding here eating flatbread again." The person who spoke was a strong child. Although his face was young, he was half a head taller than an adult. His name was Yuan Dai. He had been raised by a bear since he was a child. He had muscles of copper and bones of iron, and was extremely strong. There were many people in the Immortal Palace who were strong, but compared to him, they were far inferior. Next to Yuan Dai stood a clean and handsome young man. He was dressed in a green robe and had a jade pendant hanging from his waist. He was well groomed. His name was Bai Dong, the second son of King Bai. He was surrounded by red light and a strange fragrance when he was born. He also had the ability to see through people's minds. However, this was the bad thing about him. Whether it was King Bai's faction or the nobles, no one liked him. Even parents did not want their children to see what they were thinking at any time, let alone their subordinates. If there was a monarch who could know what they were thinking at any time, how could they still be ministers? Therefore, under the instigation of his ministers, King Bai simply sent him to the Immortal Palace. If he could catch the eye of a wandering cultivator and be taken in for cultivation, it would be the best of both worlds. These two people did not have many friends in the Immortal Palace, but they got along well with Chang Zai. Yuan Dai came up and grabbed Chang Zai. He said excitedly, "Stop eating. Let's go, let's go. I heard that there are immortals coming to the palace. If we rush there now, we might be chosen. If we are late, it will be too late." Bai Dong said slowly, "No hurry, no hurry. It is not time yet. Only we know the news now. It will take an hour or so for the steward to find everyone." Yuan Dai had a fiery temper and did not care so much. He dragged the two excitedly to the open space in the palace. As Bai Dong expected, when the three of them arrived, there were not many people who had received the news. There were only about 20 or 30 people scattered around, and most of them were disciples of the royal family and nobles. Among them, the most conspicuous was a valiant young man named Bai Tuesday. He was King Bai's nephew and Bai Dong's cousin. He was very good at archery. But this was not rare. What was rare was that he could use an empty bowstring to hurt people. In other words, even if there were no arrows, as long as there was a bow, he could shoot people to death. That was not all. It was said that Bai Tu had tried it in the palace. He could shoot 1,000 arrows in a day without eating or drinking, and each arrow could penetrate the city wall. This was very impressive. Even some cultivators who had entered the Tao just now did not have such an ability. And some people thought that perhaps the ability he possessed was not limited to what he showed. But when he saw Bai Dong come in, he was slightly unnatural. He even discreetly kept some distance from Bai Dong, apparently afraid that Bai Dong would see what he was thinking. He was not the only one. Almost everyone who knew Bai Dong's ability felt the same way. The place where Chang Zai and the other two were standing soon became empty. However, the three of them looked as if they were used to it. Needless to say, Yuan Dai and Bai Dong were the same. Although Chang Zai's strength was not conspicuous here, the iron-feathered mysterious hawk on his shoulder could tear tigers and leopards apart. About an hour later, the hundreds of children and youths in the Immortal Palace arrived one after another. After waiting for a while, 3 Taoists walked out. They modestly gestured to each other before one of them stepped forward. He looked at the children but didn't make his choice immediately. Instead, he asked the steward beside him, "I wonder if the steward has any recommendations?" The steward bowed and handed over a golden book. He said respectfully, "Immortal, they are all here." The Taoist took it and flipped through it. He already had an idea. He passed it to 2 of his peers and asked, "Which one is Bai Tu?" Bai Tu immediately stood up and bowed. "Exalted Immortal, this is the disciple." The Taoist looked at him with a happy expression. He said, "Very good, very good. Are you willing to be my disciple?" Bai Tu's aptitude was not bad. In the past, he thought that he would definitely be chosen. However, every time cultivators came, although they would praise him, none of them accepted him. Later on, he realized that cultivators did not only look at aptitude, but also fate. This was actually a disadvantage of individual cultivators. It was because the cultivation method they practiced was very simple. If a disciple did not match their cultivation method, there was not much use in accepting him. Instead, it would be a waste of resources. When Bai Tu heard that someone was willing to accept him, he was overjoyed. He said, "This disciple is willing." The Taoist smiled and said, "All right, stand behind me." Bai Tu acknowledged and stood behind the Taoist obediently. The Taoist looked very satisfied. He said to his 2 peers, "It's enough for me to accept this disciple. Next, it's up to the 2 Taoist brothers." When the children heard this, they were both envious and disappointed. According to the usual practice, immortals would usually only accept 1 or 2 disciples every time they came. Now that there were more than 100 people standing here, only 5 or 6 people might have a chance. Now that there was 1 less, they couldn't help but feel nervous. At that moment, another loose cultivator in gray robes came out. After taking a look, he chose Bai Dong. He was not in the mood to choose another one. The last loose cultivator chose Yuan Dai and another strong child. After that, he was about to leave. When Yuan Dai saw that the 2 of them had been chosen and only Chang Zai was not there, he couldn't help but feel anxious. He pointed with his finger and said, "Master, Chang Zai is also very powerful." The individual cultivator thought that he was reluctant to part with his companions. He caressed his head and said earnestly, "Disciple, you will know in the future that you are separated from the celestial world. Your companions are ultimately different from us." The Taoist took a look at Chang Zai and couldn't help but let out a sound of surprise. He found that Chang Zai's foundation was actually very good, which made him a little tempted. He couldn't help but want to take him in as a disciple. Although this child's cultivation method was not compatible with his, if the disciple's aptitude was really good, then these few flaws were nothing. However, after looking at him for a few more times, he found that there seemed to be a layer of fog around him that he couldn't see through. He thought about it and said, "What a pity, what a pity." The middle-aged individual cultivator asked curiously, "What did you see, Taoist brother?" The Taoist shook his head and said telepathically, "I really can't see through him. Maybe he has a background. It's not our fate." When the 2 individual cultivators heard this, their hearts trembled and they didn't ask any more. In this world, there were some people with good foundation who were reincarnations of cultivators. This was not something that they could interfere with. However, it could also be their wrong judgment. However, as individual cultivators, the most important thing was to avoid conflicts with the sections. In the past, when cultivation was lacking in external objects, they had no choice but to fight for everything. They had to fight for disciples and external objects. Now that the Kunsher continent had all kinds of external objects and disciples to choose from, why should they do such a thing? The three of them didn't say anything more and left with their disciples. The children in the palace saw that there was no chance this time, so they also dispersed. Chang Zai walked out of the immortal palace alone, feeling a little disappointed. It wasn't because he wasn't chosen, but because two of his good friends had left and he was the only one left. The iron-feathered mysterious eagle seemed to feel its master's low mood and rubbed its head against his, as if to comfort him. He couldn't help but feel a little better. As he walked, he found that he had arrived at the abandoned palace before. He sat on the stone steps and took out half of the unfinished flatbread and ate it in small bites. At this moment, he suddenly felt his vision darken. He looked up and saw a middle-aged Taoist with phoenix eyes and a long beard standing in front of him. He hurriedly put away the flatbread and stood up. He bowed with the etiquette taught by the immortal palace and said, "Greetings, Taoist brother." The middle-aged Taoist looked at him a few times and solemnly bowed back, saying, "We haven't seen each other for many years. Greetings, Taoist brother." Chapter 2008. In Chang Zai's impression, most of these immortals had their eyes on the top of their heads. Now that this person in front of him was so polite to him, he was at a loss for what to do. The middle-aged Taoist sighed. "We were close friends in our previous lives, so I've come to take a look in this life." Chang Zai didn't understand what he was talking about, but he felt that this Taoist was very close. Thinking about the matter of the immortal palace, he raised his small face and clenched his fists, asking expectantly, "Is Taoist here to accept me as a disciple?" The middle-aged Taoist sighed. "How would I dare to teach fellow Taoist? However, here is a technique that was passed down by fellow Taoist master. I'll pass it on to fellow Taoist now." He reached out to touch the space between Chang Zai's brows, and the latter found that there was something extra in his mind, and he fell into a half-asleep state. When Chang Zai woke up again, he found that the sky had already turned dark, and that Taoist was nowhere to be seen. There were rules for entering and leaving the immortal palace every day, and if he didn't go back now, he would be late. He exclaimed and hurried back. Shen Tong stood there and watched Chang Zai's figure gradually disappear into the distance. Then, he turned around and bowed to a place where no one was, saying, "Greetings, sect leader Wei." Wei Zihong's sleeves fluttered, and he walked out of nothingness, saying, "Sect leader Shen, you're here too." Shen Tong said, "Fellow Taoist Han and I hit it off very well back then. This time, he reincarnated and has a chance of entering Tao, but there were some twists and turns along the way, so I came to protect him. But I think I've been meddlesome." Wei Zihong smiled and said, "What are you talking about? Back then, Sect Master Shen also cultivated under Master's tutelage and is a good friend of Junior Martial Brother Han, so you can be considered as one of us. Moreover, as a Sect Master, fellow Taoist has personally come to protect us, so I must thank you." Shen Tong said in a low voice, "Sect Master Wei, I think that fellow Taoist Han's aptitude is not bad, it's just that he lacks a Tao heart. If he were to start over again in this life, if we don't bring him back first and let him experience the mortal world instead, perhaps it would be a good thing for him." He paused for a moment before continuing, "Speaking of which, I am not a disciple of Zhao Yu sect. I hope that Sect Master Wei will not take offense to my rash words." Wei Zihong sighed. "Sect leader Shen's words are a testament to our friendship. How could I take offense?" Actually, even though he'd come under Zhang Yan's orders this time, it wasn't for the sake of taking this junior brother's reincarnated body back, and it was instead to take care of this junior brother so that he wouldn't lose his life. He understood the meaning behind this, and it was to use the matters of the mortal world to temper his heart so that he wouldn't repeat the mistakes of his previous life. In the capital city of the Bai Kingdom, the king of the Bai Kingdom had a dream. He heard a voice that sounded like a woman's laughter, but it was not someone he was familiar with. He felt that it was strange. He looked around and realized that there were no guards around him. He called out a few times, but no one came. He took his bow and arrow and followed the voice. Not long after, he arrived at the backyard and saw a strange monster that looked like a deer and a cow playing among the flowers and grasses. It was also eating the strange flowers and grasses around it. When he saw it, he couldn't help but fly into a rage. He took his bow and arrow and shot. The monster jumped and dodged the arrow. Just now, he realized that there was a small person standing on the back of the beast. The person took the slingshot and shot at him, hitting him right on the forehead. The king of the Bai Kingdom let out a cry and sat up, only to realize that it was just a dream. He felt an unbearable pain on his forehead and immediately asked someone to bring a bronze mirror to look at it, only to find a red spot there. He was also bewildered and immediately set off to the temple to worship, but the Divine Lord didn't respond at all. This made him even more uneasy, and he had to find many priests to interpret the dream. Some priests thought that it was a warning from the heavens to the monarch. The monarch had done something disrespectful to his subjects and the heavens, but this was only a small offense, so they sent celestial envoys to enter the dream to warn him. Another priest said that there was a villain who had ruined the country, and that the monarch needed to examine himself, so that he could stay close to the virtuous people and stay away from the villains. However, there were also priests who thought that the birth of a strange beast in the backyard was an auspicious sign for the country, and that there was no need to worry about it. In short, there were many opinions, but none of them satisfied the king of the Bai Kingdom. At this time, someone came and suggested, "My lord, in the celestial palace, there is a child named Egon. He can distinguish good and bad, and can interpret dreams. Why don't we ask him to come and see us?" When the king of the Bai Kingdom heard this, he immediately ordered someone to find the child and asked about it. Egon was still shivering at first, but when he asked about the dream interpretation, his eyes turned black, and his pupils disappeared. It was as if he had suddenly turned into a different person. With a deep and hoarse voice, he said, "This thing is called the deer of the morning cry, also known as the dream eater. It feeds on the dreams of the rich, and when it is full, it will naturally retreat without any hindrance. However, if someone is disrespectful to it, or tries to harm it, it will start to devour the memory of the person after eating the dream, and that person will no longer remember anyone around him or even his own name." The king of the Bai Kingdom was shocked. He had used a bow to shoot the deer, and it was obvious that he had offended the strange beast. He hurriedly asked, "Is there any way to solve it?" Egon said, "My lord is a marquis, and your dreams are abundant. It will take about 30 days to finish eating. As long as you can find the deer of the morning cry within 30 days, or kill it, or drive it away, then you will be fine." The king of the Bai Kingdom asked again, "Then can I ask the divine monarch to protect me?" Egon said, "The deer of the morning cry is a strange beast reared by an immortal from overseas. I am afraid that the divine monarch is unable to control it." The king of the Bai Kingdom was also enlightened. No wonder when he went to the temple to worship, there was no response. He said, "Then can it be that I need to ask the immortal for help?" Egon said, "My lord, do you remember the little person on the back of the deer of the morning cry?" The king of the Bai Kingdom said, "Of course I remember." He subconsciously touched his forehead. Speaking of which, he was injured by the little person's slingshot. Egon said, "The little person riding on the back of the deer is a hint from the heavens that you can use it to subdue the strange beast. However, if you don't use it well, it may be disadvantageous to my lord." The king of the Bai Kingdom frowned. "Little person? Little person?" He thought again. Wasn't this Egon a little person? He said, "Can you subdue the dream beast?" Egon shook his head. "I can't, but there is someone who can." "Who is that person?" Egon said, "That person's name is Changzai." The king of the Bai Kingdom had never heard of this name. He looked to his left and right, and the manager of the immortal palace said, "This is also the Jean-bearer of the palace. This child is famous for his ability to control beasts and birds." Controlling beasts and birds? Then he can control the dream eater? The king of the Bai Kingdom's expression darkened. He immediately ordered, Pass my order, bring this child here and order him to find the Dream Eater. If he succeeds, I will reward him greatly. If he fails, he will be thrown into the river and his entire clan will be reduced to slaves." For hours later, Chang Zai was brought outside the king's hall. The manager of the Immortal Palace first comforted him for a while, then said, "Chang Zai, if you can find that strange beast, His Majesty will reward you handsomely. If you can't find it, he will punish you and your parents." Chang Zai was afraid, but he had to act according to the order. He had an ability. As long as he thought of a certain kind of bird or beast in his mind, even if he had never seen it before, he could summon it. Not long after, he heard a cry, and the figure of the Dream Eater beast appeared in his mind. He knew that he had found the master. Just as he was about to call it out, he saw that the beast was crying non-stop. He was a little curious, so he asked with his mind. Immediately, he knew the cause and effect of the matter. He couldn't bear it, but if it was only his matter, he would let it go. But his parents would also be implicated, so he had to do this. At this time, he suddenly thought of an idea and found the manager of the Immortal Palace and made a request. The manager of the Immortal Palace declined to comment and told him to wait where he was. He then came to the front of the king of the Bai Kingdom and said, "My lord, that child has found the Qiaoming deer. He said he can summon it by himself, but he begs my lord to release the strange beast. He can persuade the beast to retreat." The king of the Bai Kingdom was very dissatisfied. He said unhappily, "A mere boy holding a cup dares to talk terms with me?" The manager of the Immortal Palace said, "My lord, I think we can do this." He came up and whispered a few words. The king of the Bai Kingdom said, "Very well, let's do this." The manager of the Immortal Palace returned to where Chang Zai was and said, "My lord has agreed. As long as you let the Dream Eater beast appear in front of the monarch, kneel and admit its mistake, and promise never to come again, you will let it go." Chang Zai was very happy to hear this and closed his eyes. After a while, when he opened them again, the Dream Eater beast had appeared in front of him out of thin air. The manager of the Immortal Palace was shocked, but his expression didn't change. He said, "Come with me." Chang Zai followed him into the throne room. The king of the Bai Kingdom looked at the Qiaoming deer and said, "Are you willing to admit your mistake?" The Qiaoming deer let out a cry and knelt down. The king of the Bai Kingdom acted as if he didn't see it and asked again, "Are you willing to admit your mistake?" Chang Zai wanted to say that the Qiaoming deer couldn't speak, but was stopped by the manager of the Immortal Palace. The king of the Bai Kingdom had already asked for the third time. Immediately, an official came out and said, "This beast refuses to admit its mistake. I beg my lord to order it to be slaughtered." The king of the Bai Kingdom said expressionlessly, "Granted." There was a prohibition set up by the rogue cultivators in the hall, so there was no fear that the Qiaoming deer would escape again. Immediately, an attendant came forward and hacked the beast to death. Chang Zai had never thought that this would be the result. He was stunned for a moment and then became angry. As if sensing his thoughts, the iron-feathered mysterious eagle on his shoulder flew up. However, before it could reach a high altitude, an arrow shot out like lightning and pierced through its body. It fell down with a wail. On the stairs, a guard in golden armor put down his bow and arrow without any expression. Chang Zai was still a child after all. Seeing this, he rushed forward with a cry and held up the eagle with tears all over his face. He found that the once powerful wings had become extremely weak. The manager of the Immortal Palace asked, "My lord, what should we do with this child?" The king of the Bai Kingdom hesitated and said, "Lock him up first." Although he didn't like Chang Zai, he didn't know if he would encounter such a thing in the future. Maybe this child would be useful then. Chang Zai was immediately taken away by the attendant and imprisoned in a small stone room. He wiped his tears and sat there hugging his knees, sobbing from time to time. His little face was full of regret. After a long time, he heard a sigh and found that the middle-aged Taoist he saw during the day was standing in front of him again. He stood up at once and wiped away his tears, saying, "Taoist? Why are you here?" Shen Dong looked at him and said, "Do you know what you did wrong this time?" Chang Zai thought about it and lowered his head, saying, I shouldn't have believed the manager and my lord's words. Shen Dong said in a low voice, "No, your mistake is that you're just a boy holding a cup, but you want to reason with the emperor." He spoke slowly as if he wanted to imprint these words into Chang Zai's heart. In this world, power comes before reason. You're just a child without power or influence. Even if I bully you, what can you do? If you're the ruler of a country with millions of subjects behind you, then the king of the Bai Kingdom will treat your words seriously. If you're a divine monarch or someone who has entered the Tao, then the king of the Bai Kingdom won't dare to go against your wishes. In the end, it's because you're weak. If you're strong enough, you can move heaven and earth with a word and shock ghosts and gods with a word. Chapter 2009. After Chang Zai heard this, he felt a surge of qi in his chest, as if it was about to burst out. He asked, "Taoist, what should I do?" Shen Dong said, "Fellow Taoist, you will naturally gain something from cultivating that technique." What he taught was the clear qi scripture. Most Taoist disciples in the world used this method to cultivate before opening their meridians. Even Qinsong school was no exception. It looked shallow on the surface, but it was the best for entering Tao. Zhang Yan did not make any changes to it even after reaching his current realm. Chang Zai said seriously, "I will listen to Taoist." Shen Dong looked at him and nodded slowly. "Fellow Taoist, you must remember that cultivating Tao is to cultivate the heart. If you do not have the heart to improve, then it is useless no matter how much you cultivate. Although this is a prison, it can block out external disturbances and calm your heart. The day you succeed is the day you will leave." After he finished speaking, he disappeared just as he had come. After he left, Chang Zai tried to cultivate in the prison. His aptitude was good after all. After a day, he gradually gained a sense of qi. However, he was more hardworking than Shen Dong had imagined. Although he did not really understand Shen Dong's words, he understood one thing. Chao Minglu was like him. If Bai Wang could kill the deer today, then he might be able to kill him tomorrow. This gave him a strong sense of fear and an urgent need for power. Shen Dong came out of the palace and turned around, arriving in the abandoned palace. Wei Zihong was standing there. He said, "Fellow Taoist, you have deviated from junior brother Han's nature by doing this." Shen Dong said in a low voice, "Rather than letting fellow Taoist Han reincarnate again, it is better to let him succeed in this life. Sect leader Wei did not come out to stop me, so you must have the same opinion." Wei Zihong looked at him and nodded. He said, "Sect leader Shen is right. Now that the fellow disciples have returned to master's seat, as the senior brother, I naturally do not want to see junior brother Han rolling in the mud of the mortal world again." In reality, the things that he had encountered were the tempering that he should have received in this life. However, whether he would choose to submit or resist was not fixed. Perhaps he would choose the former, or perhaps he would choose the latter. However, after Shen Dong said those words, he was forced to rise up and fight back. But this was what he wanted to see. That day, when he was questioning Zhang Yan in the Qinghuan Palace, he had faintly sensed that his teachers seemed to be making some kind of preparation. Based on past situations, this undoubtedly meant that a great enemy was about to arrive. He guessed that the entire Busha heaven might not be stable, so he hoped that he would be able to help his teachers and fellow disciples when the time came. He had once calculated that if Han Zhuqing stepped into the Tao in this life, then he would have a high chance of reaching the upper level. However, if he missed this chance, or if he didn't fight for it due to his own Tao heart, then who knew how many lives he would have to wait before he would have a chance again. At the very least, he couldn't calculate it. As the senior brother, he didn't want to see such an outcome, so he thought of a way to help Han Zhuqing. After King Bai ordered Chang Zai to be locked up, he did not say what to do with him, but he quickly put the matter to the back of his mind. It was just a child from the celestial palace, not worthy of his consideration. In the blink of an eye, 6 years had passed. On this day, King Bai was commenting on the bamboo slips when an attendant hurried in and reported, "My lord, the 2 young masters Bai Tu and Bai Dong have returned." King Bai's expression tightened and asked, "How did they return?" The attendant said, "My lord, I heard that the 2 celestial masters released the 2 young masters to come back to visit their relatives." King Bai was overjoyed. For a sect, be it a monarch or a commoner, it was all the same. Once you entered the sect, you would be a disciple. Whether you had any connection with the mortal world was not in their eyes. But it was different for a wandering cultivator. Because their cultivation was usually not high, they needed a country to support them, to help them collect external objects, to provide services, and to save a lot of time for cultivation. So they would return the favor and take care of the country, mutually benefiting from each other. What King Bai hoped most was that the descendants of the royal family could be apprenticed to a Taoist cultivator and influence the sect behind them. Unfortunately, his wish had never been fulfilled. In the past, there were many who were taken in for cultivation, but after a few years, they were driven back again, saying that they could not pass the meridian barrier and could not enter the path of immortality, so they could only return to be immortal. Although these people had some ability, they could not be compared to a true Taoist cultivator. Otherwise, he could have asked a wandering cultivator to come and solve the problem of Chao Minglu. And the current situation was clearly great news. In his joy, he threw the brush in his hand and said, "The prosperity of my Bai kingdom is right in front of me." He thought for a moment and said, "Summon Bai Tu to the orchid garden, I have something to ask him." The attendant said, "My lord, where is the second young master?" King Bai frowned and said, "Let him stay here, there is no need to see me. But if he wants anything, don't be short of it." This son of his could see through people's hearts. He must be even more powerful now, so it was better not to meet him face to face. After Bai Dong came back, he stayed in his original residence for the night. Not long after, a palace attendant came to announce a reward. After he accepted the reward, he asked, "May I ask, attendant, when can I go and pay my respects to my father?" The palace attendant said awkwardly, "His Majesty said that it is rare for you to come back, so let young master rest well. If there is anything lacking, just let me know and everything will be prepared for young master." Bai Dong snorted and said, "It seems that my father still does not want to see me." The palace attendant smiled bitterly and said, "Young master, His Majesty also has his own difficulties." Bai Dong sighed and said, I know, I won't go and be disliked." He thought for a moment and said, "By the way, does attendant leader know of a person in the immortal palace called Chang Zai?" The palace attendant's expression changed slightly and he lowered his head and said, "I do not know." Bai Dong was just asking casually. The imperial hall and the immortal palace had nothing to do with each other. How could a palace attendant know about the immortal palace? He waved his hand and said, "Attendant leader, please go back." The palace attendant was relieved, bowed and retreated. But after returning, he immediately asked someone to secretly send this news to the immortal palace's management office. After Bai Dong rested for a night in his residence, he went to the immortal palace the next day to look for Chang Zai. But the news he received was that Chang Zai had returned to his hometown not long after they left 6 years ago. He asked Chang Zai where his hometown was and tried to find it, but after searching for it he could not find any old records. But at this time, an immortal palace attendant came and secretly told him all the truth. After Bai Dong heard it, he was furious. He really treated Chang Zai as a good friend, but he did not expect that Chang Zai would be treated so unfairly after helping King Bai. He said, "I want to see my father and ask him to release Chang Zai." The palace attendant turned pale and said, young master, His Majesty does not want to see you. It is a serious crime to disobey the emperor's order." He came to report this matter in order to make a connection with Bai Dong, the future immortal. He did not want to see him fail and die before he succeeded. Bai Dong sneered and said, "Then let my father chop off my head." He was now a Taoist cultivator, so King Bai could not do anything to him. At most, it would worsen the relationship between father and son. But he did not care about this. Since he was 4 years old, he had not seen his father again. At this moment, Shen Dong was standing in the palace, watching Bai Dong walk out angrily. Although there were many guards on both sides, no one could see him. From the perspective of Chang Zai's fate, there was originally this tribulation, and in the end, it fell into the hands of Bai Dong. Next, it was to follow Chang Zai out and find his own opportunity. But if he went according to the original fate, he might not be able to achieve the expectations of Wei Zihong and him, so he had to find a way to intervene here. Chang Zai wanted to go out, but he also needed to achieve a certain level of cultivation, and now he was at a critical juncture. After a period of time, when he came out, he could directly try to open his meridians, which would be one step faster than the original fate. But doing so would undoubtedly cause Chang Zai to suffer more, but this was also Shindong's purpose. In his opinion, if he did not do so, it would not be enough to polish his Taoist heart in this life. Bai Dong walked outside and suddenly saw a young cultivator standing there. He said in surprise, "Senior brother, why are you here?" The young cultivator came up and grabbed him, dragging him outside. He said, "Junior brother, Master has opened a furnace of medicinal pills. Both of us are blessed. Quickly follow me back, or it will not be good if we miss the time." Bai Dong was shocked. "Senior brother, but, no buts." The young cultivator interrupted him and said seriously, "Junior brother, let me give you a word of advice. Don't pay too much attention to the matters of the mortal world. Let me ask you, after 100 years, how many people can you know? And how many can be friends with you?" Bai Dong hesitated. "Senior brother, I know what you said, but if I don't do this, my heart will not be at ease." Without waiting for the young cultivator to speak, he sighed, "I only left a letter. Regardless of whether it succeeds or not, I just want to do my best." The young cultivator thought for a moment, then let go of his hand and said, "Junior brother, go quickly, I will wait for you here." Half an hour later, King Bai received the letter from Bai Dong. After reading it, he said angrily, "Why should a child like you meddle in my affairs?" With a sullen face, he called for his attendant and asked, "How is my son Chang Zai?" The attendant was stunned for a moment before he remembered who King Bai was asking about. He quickly said, "Reporting to your majesty, Chang Zai has been imprisoned in the stone chamber for the past few years and has not been released. Does your majesty want to see him?" King Bai wanted to take his life, but he was afraid that his son would really turn against him. At this time, Bai Tu was at the side. With a glance at the letter, he could almost guess the reason. He could not help but be moved. He knew Chang Zai's ability, and he might be of some use to his sect. He said, "If your majesty does not like Chang Zai, why not let me take him away?" King Bai frowned. "What do you mean?" Bai Tu said with a smile, "Teacher has something to do recently, and it just so happens that he is lacking a beast tamer. Since Chang Zai is good at this, why not let me take care of him? It can be considered as doing his best. Even if Brother Dong comes back in the future, he will not blame it on your majesty." When King Bai heard this, although he felt that it was inappropriate to keep Chang Zai, since this was Bai Tu's suggestion, and it also involved the immortal master behind him, he could not refuse. He said, "As you say." Chapter 2010. There was still some time before Bai Tu returned to visit his family, so he was not in a hurry to release Chang Zai. After staying for a month or so, he was finally ready to set off. Only then did he instruct his subordinates to bring Chang Zai out. In the cave manor, Chang Zai sat cross-legged. Even though he was only a little over 10 years old, he looked like a 15 or 16-year-old youth. At this moment, he was doing breathing exercises every day, but recently he felt that his aura was filling up, as if he had reached a bottleneck that he could not break through. Staying here for 6 years, isolated from the world, had honed his patience. Now that he encountered a difficulty, he was not distressed, but rather eager to try. Based on his previous experience, once he broke through, there would be a huge improvement in his cultivation. Just as he was about to think of a way to overcome this obstacle, a figure flashed in front of him, and Shindong appeared before him again. Chang Zai immediately stood up and said happily, "Taoist, you're here. I have a question here to ask." Shindong said, "You don't have to cultivate these few days." Chang Zai was shocked and said, "Taoist, why is that?" Shindong said, "Your cultivation is filling up, and you can open your meridians. In a few days, you can go out." Under his push, Han Zwicheng was already on a different path, but how he would continue was up to him. "Open my meridians?" Chang Zai was confused at first, then he said with surprise, "I can go out?" Shendong first explained what opening meridians was, then said, "The person who will pick you up will be here in a while. Just wait." Hearing his confirmation, Chang Zai could not help but jump on the spot. In these 6 years, Shendong had come many times, mainly to give him pointers on the difficult problems he faced in cultivation. He had also given him many books that increased his knowledge, but he had never mentioned rescuing him. Now that he heard this, he almost could not help but cheer. After all, no one wanted to stay in a place where there was no daylight. Shendong handed over a hairband and said, "Take this. Everything you can use after you go out is in here. When you need to use it, just take it off and inject inner qi into it." Chang Zai took it and tugged at it, then grabbed the hair and tied it up casually. Shendong said, "Your vital energy is complete now. If you go out, you'll definitely be noticed by others. I'll help you conceal it." As he spoke, he started to chant a technique. Chang Zai listened attentively at first, but after a while he felt abnormally sleepy and drowsy. In the end, he couldn't hold on any longer and laid down to sleep. When he woke up, he found that the light was a little dazzling and his lower body was a little bumpy. However, there seemed to be something cool and comfortable on his eyelids. It was very comfortable. After blinking a little, he got used to it. He touched the back of his head and saw that the ribbon was still there. He relaxed. He sat up and looked around. He realized that he was lying in a spacious carriage. Not far from him, there was a maid who was dozing off. She raised her head and saw that he had woken up. She said happily, "Lang Jun, you're awake?" Before Chang Zai could say anything, the maid went out again. After a while, she came back with a bowl of fragrant hot porridge. Before a cultivator has opened his meridians, the acquired essence of the grains was still very important. When Chang Zai was imprisoned, King Bai did not tell him how to deal with him, and his subordinates did not want to starve him to death. However, he did not expect to eat anything good either. Most of the food was coarse grains that were difficult to swallow. Apart from that, there was also the bitter pill that Shendong often gave him. Now, looking at the thick yellow rice porridge mixed with finely minced meat, the fragrance of the meat went straight to his nose, and he could not help swallowing his saliva. The maidservant chuckled and said, "Lang Jun has been imprisoned in the stone room for 6 years, and his body is weak. Please eat some meat porridge to nourish your body." She then put down the bowl and said, "Lang Jun, please enjoy." She bowed and left. The moment Chang Zai saw her go out, he couldn't wait to pick up the bowl and gulp down the food with a porcelain spoon. After finishing the bowl, he became even hungrier. He had wanted to add a few more bowls, but when he called the maidservant in, she adamantly refused, saying that his body was still weak and he couldn't eat too much. He was helpless as well. Fortunately, he'd been imprisoned for 6 years, and his endurance had become much stronger. He forcefully suppressed his hunger and asked, "Where are we going?" "Let me answer this question, Lang Jun Chang." With this voice, a young man with a beard lifted the curtain and walked in. He said, "Lang Jun Chang, do you still recognize me?" Chang Zai looked at him and said, "Master Bai?" Bai Tu laughed and said, "It's me." He waved his hand and ordered the maid to leave. He then rolled up his sleeves and sat in front of Chang Zai. "You disobeyed His Majesty's will and let the eagles do evil in the palace. Originally, His Majesty wanted to imprison you for life, but this time I came back to visit my family. After hearing about this matter, I took pity on your ability and pleaded in front of His Majesty, so you were released." Chang Zai was surprised and said, "So it was Master Bai who saved me?" Bai Tu said, "Yes, but I don't expect you to thank me for saving you. I just want you to do something for me." "What is it?" Bai Tu smiled and said, "There's no rush. We'll talk after I see teacher." He looked at him again and said, "I see that your body is weak, so I'll teach you a set of breathing techniques. After you practice it, you'll know the benefits." He took out a book from his sleeve and placed it on the table. He tapped it with his finger and then stood up to leave. Chang Zai picked it up and took a look, but his mouth twitched. This was a cultivation of qi, but it was far from the clear qi scripture. He took a few glances and threw it to the side. He touched his belt and poured a bit of inner qi into it. He felt that he could see another place that was not in front of him. After a brief inspection, He found that there were all kinds of external medicine for opening meridians. He just had to find an opportunity to open his meridians and break through, but now was not the time. After traveling for a month, the carriage stopped in front of a peak. Chang Zai then followed Bai Tu up the mountain and came to a Taoist temple with cedar trees planted in front of it. Bai Tu was the first to enter. After a long time, he was called in. He saw the Taoist who had come to the Immortal Palace to choose a disciple all those years ago. He understood quite a few things these past few days, and knew that this Taoist Shi was Bai Tu's teacher. Taoist Shi looked him up and down a few times. Although he had been imprisoned for a few years, he was still in good spirits and did not look dispirited at all. Other than his slightly pale skin, he had delicate features. She nodded and said, "You are a talented young man. Bai Tu did not misjudge you." Chang Zai said, "Thank you for your praise, Taoist." Taoist Shi chuckled and said, "Bai Tu said that you are good at controlling birds and beasts. Can you control a serpent-scaled sparrow?" Chang Zai said, "Reporting to Taoist Immortal, as long as there is a serpent-scaled sparrow nearby, I can do it." Taoist Shi said, "If I want you to use this bird to attack a herd of rubber oxen, can you do it?" Chang Zai thought about it and said, "This kind of sparrow is wild and unruly. If that's the case, I'm afraid I'll have to ride it myself. It's best if it's at night." Bai Tu suddenly interrupted and asked, "Why at night?" Taoist Shi waved her hand and said, "Rubber oxen have weak eyesight at night and cannot see too many of their companions. They are not brave and are easily frightened. This suggestion is correct." Bai Tu bowed and said, "Teacher is wise." Taoist Shi said to Chang Zai in a gentle tone, "Recently, I need to deal with a herd of rubber oxen. If you do this well, I will bring you into Taoism." Chang Zai lowered his head and said, "Thank you, Taoist Zhang." Taoist Shi nodded and said, "You may leave." Chang Zai immediately bowed and left with a Taoist child, remaining silent along the way. He was still young and had not experienced the affairs of the world. However, after being deceived by King Bai, he didn't dare to trust anyone easily. Moreover, after reading the various historical books and illusions that Shindong had given him, he was no longer a child who knew nothing. In the Immortal Palace, he knew that most of these Taoist immortals only had 2 disciples. It was impossible for them to have more. This promise was actually empty talk. In fact, he didn't care about this, but he was afraid of what was behind it. It was obvious that only a small profit was needed to make him serve him, but this Taoist immortal made such a promise that was impossible to fulfill. It was obvious that he had never considered fulfilling it. After thinking about it carefully, he felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't help but make up his mind that he had to find a way to escape from this place. In the following months, Taoist Shi never came to find him, as if she had forgotten about this matter. Until one night, when he was meditating, a Taoist child suddenly came to call for him. He knew that the matter had finally come. He slightly calmed his nervous emotions and tidied up a little before following the Taoist child out. Along the way to the front of the Taoist temple, he saw Taoist Shi Bai Tu and another youth standing on a flying boat. He was about to go forward and greet them when Taoist Shi waved her hand and said, "Time is pressing, so there's no need to stand on ceremony. Quickly come on up." Chang Zai quickly walked onto the flying boat. The flying boat immediately rose up into the sky. However, he had flown on an eagle before, so he didn't show any signs of panic. Along the way, Taoist Shi didn't speak, so everyone was silent. The atmosphere was very oppressive. Chang Zai had been imprisoned for 6 years and had long since been able to endure the loneliness, so he didn't feel uncomfortable at all. After flying for 2 hours, the flying boat slowly came to a stop. At this moment, Taoist Shi opened her eyes and looked over with some dignity. She said, "Chang Zai, there's a dragon-scaled sparrow near you. You can try to call it over." Chang Zai said yes and called it in his heart. Not long after, he heard the sound of flapping wings. A spotted sparrow about 3 meters long flew over and circled around the flying boat. Taoist Shi nodded and said, "Not bad. You're indeed capable." Chang Zai said, "Immortal Elder praises me too much." Taoist Shi pointed to a hazy valley in the distance and said, "The herd of rubber oxen is right below." Go down and drive them away. That will be a great merit. Chang Zai said, Yes, immortal elder. Taoist she slowed down her tone and said, My previous promise still stands. Go. Chang Zai went up the side of the boat and jumped out onto the back of the large sparrow. The large sparrow was very obedient. After circling once more, it flew in the direction of the valley. When Taoist Shi saw him go far away, she turned around and said to her 2 disciples, That spiritual milk only appears once in 1,000 years. Once you get it, you'll have hopes of ascending to the upper realm in the future. Bai Tu and the youth bowed and said, Thank you, teacher, for your guidance. Taoist Shi said again, It's just that this item can reconstruct one's foundation and increase the aptitude of us Taoists. Countless itinerant cultivators covet it, so this matter must not be leaked. When that kid drives away the herd of rubber oxen, you know what to do. I hope you won't care about our past friendship. Bai Tu said calmly, Teacher, don't worry. I know the severity of the matter. Although he and Chang Zai were old acquaintances, for the sake of his own Tao path, he could only choose to apologize. Moreover, Chang Zai wasn't a Taoist cultivator. He was merely a commoner and ultimately couldn't be mentioned in the same breath as him. Using the life of a commoner to help him, whether it was from the standpoint of a noble young master or a Taoist cultivator, he felt that it was only natural. Chapter 2011. Chang Zai rode the serpent-scaled sparrow and circled above the herd of rubber oxen for a while. It looked like he was looking for an opportunity to attack, but at the moment, he was extremely nervous. Recently, he had become more and more convinced of his own judgment. There must be something here that was very important. Taoist Shi didn't want him to bring the secret back, so he had been looking for an opportunity to escape. Now that he was far away from the master and disciples, he knew that the opportunity had come. However, Taoist Shi was definitely watching him, and if he escaped on the serpent-scaled sparrow, it would be too obvious. He was afraid that once he moved, he would immediately be discovered. He didn't know what Taoist Shi's cultivation was, but it shouldn't be difficult for her to catch up to him. Fortunately, he had already known what he was going to do several months ago, so he had managed to summon many birds that could be used as mounts. At the moment, they were following him from afar, waiting for his summons. The rubber oxen below finally noticed the serpent-scaled sparrow circling in the sky. The appearance of their natural enemy immediately caused them to panic, and they began to rumble as they ran. Chang Zai immediately controlled the sparrow to dive down. At the same time, a spirit bird received his summons and immediately rushed over. With a leap, he landed on its back and ordered the serpent-scaled sparrow to continue chasing the rubber oxen. Meanwhile, he urged the spirit bird beneath him, and with the help of the smoke, he flew into the distance. Taoist Shi saw that the herd of rubber oxen was in chaos and knew that the matter had been accomplished. Even with his deep character, he still praised Chang Zai. He didn't think too much about Chang Zai. They were surrounded by the wilderness, and Chang Zai couldn't go anywhere without them. However, he was a person with keen senses. After waiting for a while, he couldn't help but frown when Chang Zai didn't return. The matter of the spiritual milk must not be leaked. Although the possibility was very small because Chang Zai didn't know what they were looking for, the other cultivators weren't stupid. Once someone learned about the general situation here through Chang Zai, they would probably immediately guess what they were doing here. Even if they didn't think of it, as long as they became suspicious, there would never be a day of peace here. He said with a sullen face, Bai Tu, I'll give you the flying boat. Go find Chang Zai. Don't say anything when you see him, just kill him immediately. Bai Tu was stunned. He had the same thoughts as Taoist. Where could Chang Zai go? Moreover, he didn't know that they were going to take his life, so there was no reason for him to escape. However, he knew that he was the one who found them. If there was a problem, it would be his fault. He gritted his teeth and said, Yes, master. He took a few steps forward, flipped himself onto the flying boat, picked up the token, shook it, and soared into the air. He looked into the distance. Just now, there was no movement in the east and west. Only the north was covered by smoke and dust. Therefore, if Chang Zai wanted to escape, he could only pass through this place. He believed that as long as he chased in this direction, he would definitely find Chang Zai. He immediately shook the talisman and searched in that direction. Chang Zai was indeed flying towards the north. He didn't dare to leap too high and only flew close to the ground. He was worried that Taoist Shi would catch up to him, so he was very careful. Along the way, he changed his mounts several times and finally landed in front of a cave. This was where the bird he was sitting on originally resided. It was on the cliff, but the path below was winding and led straight to the depths of the ground. In fact, this place was filled with such underground caves. He had used flying birds to explore the surroundings for several months before he found these places. Once inside, he immediately ran down. The complicated and winding underground path gave him an incomparably safe feeling. However, he also knew that if the other party really came looking for him, these probably wouldn't be enough to stop them. When he reached the deeper regions, there were flowing underground rivers everywhere. He found a narrow and waterless cave and squeezed in with great effort. He then untied his headband and found an invisibility talisman. He stuck it on his body, and his aura instantly disappeared. In reality, there was a set of formation flags in the headband, but as someone who had not opened his meridians, he had no way of using them. He could only use this method now. Bai Tu kept circling in the sky, searching back and forth, but he didn't find any traces of Chang Zai. He grew more and more frustrated. Chang Zai had only left not long ago. He didn't believe that he could have gone far in such a short time. He must have found a place to hide, but he just couldn't find him. At daybreak, he returned to his original place with a dejected expression. He lowered his head and said, "Master, disciple is useless. I didn't find Chang Zai's whereabouts. Please punish me, master." At this time, Taoist Shi had already taken advantage of the situation to obtain the spiritual milk. However, his good mood from before had completely vanished after this incident. He snorted and said, "Why would I punish you? If we can't find this child once the news is leaked, there will be countless fellow Taoists who will come looking for us. At that time, us three will all lose our lives." Both Bai Tu and the other youth paled when they heard this. Taoist Shi pondered for a moment. This kid was prepared. I underestimated him. However, he definitely can't have gone far. He's most likely hiding somewhere. Wait for me to perform a divination and find his whereabouts. He immediately performed a divination, but just now, when he wanted to clearly divine Chang Zai's whereabouts, his expression changed. He realized that he actually couldn't find Chang Zai's whereabouts. If he forced it, then the price would be unimaginably great. This situation meant that Chang Zai was already a Taoist cultivator, so he couldn't perform divination. This result shocked and angered him. He knew that Bai Tu had passed on a breathing technique to Chang Zai, but this technique was very crude. It was impossible for him to cultivate anything decent in such a short amount of time. This undoubtedly meant that Chang Zai had already stepped onto the path of Tao before he had come to their side. Who had passed on this Taoist technique to him? Where was this person? Could it be that everything he had done had been seen? Or was he just bait? Thankfully, he didn't panic. After calmly thinking about it, he believed that Chang Zai had been imprisoned in the palace, so it was most likely that he had learned something at that time. Perhaps there was something in that stone room, or perhaps there was some expert hidden in the palace. Because Bai Tu had found Chang Zai on a whim, it didn't seem like it had been arranged beforehand. When he thought of this, he calmed down a lot. If he wanted to find a person's whereabouts, even if he couldn't divine it, there were still other methods. He ordered the youth beside him, "Go and find a few Luo hounds." The youth acknowledged, and in a short while he brought over a few small dogs with large heads, drooping ears, and flat noses. These spirit dogs could distinguish a person's aura, and they could cross mountains and rivers as if they were walking on flat ground. As long as they remembered a person's aura, they would never forget it. Although Chang Zai's own clothes had all been taken away by him, his aura still lingered around his residence. This was unavoidable. Unless a cultivator had reached the meridian opening stage and purposely restrained himself, there wouldn't be any traces left. The youth led the Luo hounds around the area where Chang Zai had lived. The few spirit dogs twitched their noses, barked a few more times, and scurried out. Bai Tu and the youth were overjoyed and immediately followed. Chang Zai lay on the ground, wondering if he had left any flaws behind. However, he felt that he had overlooked something, but he couldn't think of what it was. After all, he was young and limited by his knowledge. It was already not bad for him to be able to do this, but he couldn't cover everything. After thinking about it, he felt that Taoist Shi wouldn't give up so easily. She must still be searching everywhere for him, so he couldn't leave this place yet. Since there was still time, he might as well open his meridians here first. This was an extremely dangerous choice. If a cultivator encountered an enemy while opening his meridians, it would undoubtedly be a suicidal move. However, he couldn't care less about this. If the other party really found his hiding place, he wouldn't be able to defend himself with his current level, so it wouldn't be too bad. He did what he thought of. He sat up and took out the external meridian opening medicine from his belt. Shen Dong had already told him what to do at this stage. Now that he was done, he just had to follow the prescribed order. After Bai Tu and the youth chased out, to prevent Chang Zai from really escaping, the youth patrolled in the sky on the flying boat while Bai Tu searched on the ground. However, they didn't find anything. Fortunately, these Luo hounds kept chasing in a certain direction and never stopped halfway, which meant that they hadn't lost their target. Not long after, all the Luo hounds stopped in front of a cliff and started barking at a cave above. Bai Tu stuck a body-lifting talisman on himself and climbed up. Soon he arrived at the cave. He looked down a few times and found shallow footprints that extended deep into the cave. He couldn't help but exclaim in joy, "Found it?" The Luo hounds also scurried in at this moment. Then they started barking and chased down one of the tunnels. Bai Tu saw them and hurriedly followed. On the other side, Taoist Shi was reflecting. He had always been careful, so how could he have made such a mistake? In reality, as long as he left a trick on Chang Zai beforehand, he wouldn't have to patch up this mistake afterwards. Although this move was a bit like bullying, when it involved such a matter of life and death, why would he care about such things? No, that's not right. As he pondered deeply, he just now remembered that he seemed to have seen this child before, and he suspected that there was karma behind him, so he didn't touch him at that time. However, when he saw him just now, he actually didn't remember that scene at all, nor did he think that they were the same person. To cultivators, this kind of thing was logically impossible, so why was it like this? He suddenly thought of a possibility, and his expression changed involuntarily. He glanced outside. Regardless of whether things were as he guessed, it was definitely not right to stay here. He had to find a way to leave. Now that he had obtained the spiritual milk, there was no harm in changing disciples. If Bai Tu and Shi were fine, then he could find them again in the future. With this thought in mind, he immediately leaped up and flew into the sky. Bai Tu followed the Luo hounds. No matter how complicated the underground passage was, it was nothing to him. Very soon, he arrived at a spacious underground hall. On the opposite stone platform, Chang Zai was sitting there in good condition. He was instantly overjoyed and shouted, "Chang Zai, I've finally found you. Let's see where else you can run to." At this moment, Chang Zai also saw him and stood up. He said, "Looks like I guessed right. You and your disciple really want to take my life." He looked at the Luo hounds again and said, "But you brought these little dogs in. Aren't you giving me more helpers?" Bai Tu's expression changed, and he felt that something was wrong. In the next moment, the Luo hounds in front of him turned around and bit at him. Chapter 2012. When Bai Tu saw the Luo hounds approaching, he couldn't help but dodge in panic. Fortunately, he was no longer an ordinary person, and his movements were also extremely fast. However, the robe on his body was torn apart, and when he saw this scene, he broke out in a cold sweat. These spirit hounds didn't look big, but they could tear apart metal and stone. If he was bitten, his limbs would definitely be crippled. Even if he had already entered the path of Tao, he had yet to open his meridians. At most, his strength was much greater than that of an ordinary person. He did not have much chance of winning against these spirit dogs, especially with what Chang Zai had said. It was hard to say if there was anything else in the surroundings. "That's right, Chang Zai. When he thought of this, he immediately reacted. These spirit dogs were originally raised by him, but they had been bewitched by Chang Zai. As long as he got rid of the person, then the danger would be easily resolved. He quickly retreated a few steps, grabbed a handful of talismans from his bosom, and tossed them out. The bodies of the Luo hounds immediately became sluggish, as if they were bound by something, and their movements became much slower. These talismans were all body-restraining talismans. They were usually used to deal with ferocious beasts and wild demons in the mountains. The power of these talismans was not great, and could only trap the target for 8 to 9 breaths of time. Fortunately, this short moment was enough for him. Taking advantage of this gap, he took out several items from his robes and clenched them in his palm. With a shake of his hand, he threw them out. Several rays of white light shot towards the stage. As an itinerant disciple, he did not have any talisman to defeat the enemy. Taoist, she only had a few talismans that had been sacrificially refined by others. She had even used up a lot of her savings, so naturally she would not hand them over to her disciple. This was merely a flying locust stone that had been sacrificially refined. However, with his current strength of 500 kilograms, it was enough to shatter rocks and shatter gold. Chang Zai stood there without moving. When the flying locust stone was about 10 feet away from him, it seemed to hit an invisible barrier. With a crack, it shattered and scattered all over the ground. Now that he had successfully opened his meridians, he had already set up formation flags around him. Naturally, he was not afraid of these things. Bai Tu saw that the flying locust stone had no effect, and could not help but be shocked. Then he suddenly thought of something, and panic and disbelief surfaced in his eyes. Could it be that you have already opened your meridians? Chang Zai had nothing to hide and said, "That's right." Originally, Bai Tu regarded Chang Zaishi as a mortal, a nobody who could take his life at any time. Who knew that in a twinkling of an eye, Chang Zaishi was above him, which made him really unacceptable. But no matter how unacceptable it was already a fact. He shivered, turned around, and ran. If he waited for those Luo hounds to break free, he might not be able to escape. He had already calculated that it would not be too late to deal with Chang Zai after he found his master. Even if the latter had opened his meridians, he would not be a match for the three of them. However, it was easy to come in, but difficult to leave. He realized that after running for a long time, he still couldn't get out. Even though he was following Luo Quan when he entered, he was a cultivator in the end, and he would absolutely not forget the paths he'd taken. Presently, this situation caused him to feel panic in his heart. But at this moment, he was unable to come up with any way to deal with it, so he could only brace himself and continue running. Chang Zai looked at Bai Tu, who was running around not far from him, but ultimately did not go far. He breathed a sigh of relief in his heart and thought to himself, "This array is indeed useful." At this moment, it was best to wait for Bai Tu to slowly exhaust his strength, but he was not sure if Taoist Shi would come, so he could only resolve this as soon as possible. He touched his belt and took out a golden arrow talisman. Similarly, he did not have any artifacts, so he could only rely on this to injure the enemy. In reality, the array flag had this ability, but just now, he had learned it and did not have much inner chi to control it. It was already not bad to be able to set it up, but it was impossible to use it to attack the enemy. He aimed the talisman at where Bai Tu was and threw it out, hitting him right in the back. Bai Tu cried out and fell forward. At this moment, the Luo hounds had also broken free from their restraints and came up to bite his limbs, instantly causing him to lose the ability to escape. Bai Tu turned pale with fright and shouted, "Spare me, Chang Zai, it was I who saved you. If it wasn't for me, you would still be suffering in the prison." Chang Zai frowned and said, "But it was also you who wanted to take my life just now." Bai Tu explained, "I didn't want to do this, but I was under Master's orders to capture you. Master's orders cannot be disobeyed. Besides, I didn't really want to take your life. As long as you let me go, I can still convince Master not to make things difficult for you." Chang Zai hesitated for a moment and then became determined. He said, "If I keep you, I'll be stupid. I'm sorry." He took out a soul-snatching talisman and aimed it at Bai Tuesday. After a few breaths, A beam of spiritual light shot out from it and dragged Baitu's spirit out of his body. It was unknown where he had taken it. Usually, those who had not opened their meridians were almost unable to resist this talisman. Baitu's head drooped, and his lifeless body sprawled weakly on the ground. Changzai stood in a daze for a moment. After a while, he suddenly remembered that Baitu still had a fellow disciple outside, so he used his heart to summon a sparrow outside to investigate. However, that youth was a clever person. Seeing that Baitu had not come out for a long time, he did not come down to look for him. Instead, he turned and left. This person did not enter the formation, so Changzai did not have the ability to do anything to him. Because he was afraid that Taoist Shi would catch up, he immediately left the crypt and rode away on the sparrow. At the same time, he sent a few spiritual birds to circle behind him. If there was any movement, they would immediately go down and set up a formation to hide. However, after a dozen days, he did not see Taoist Shi come over. Only then did he slightly relax. However, he was now at a loss. After leaving Bai country, where should he go? He had wanted to return to Mount Dijia, but on second thought, if he led Taoist Shi there, then he would probably implicate his parents. However, Shen Tong had long said that his parents would be taken care of, so it would be fine if he did not go. It was just that he missed them very much after not seeing them for a few years. Finally, after some thought, he summoned a bird over and wrote a letter. He used a roll of paper to tie it to the bird's leg and asked it to send it back. He watched the bird fly away, turned around, and walked towards the boundless mountains with a few Luo hounds. In the blink of an eye, another 6 years passed. On a cliff that faced the lake, there was a row of caves. Outside was a long and narrow stone platform that was protected by a row of red railings. Changzai wore a brown robe and sat in the stone room in the middle of the cave. A few days ago, he had already entered the mystic light realm, and his aura was bursting. Looking from afar, his body seemed to be covered in a layer of light. The belt that Shen Tong had given him only contained medicine for opening meridians, so in the past few years, all the external items he used were found by himself or exchanged with some wandering cultivators. Not only that, even what he wore and what he used daily was personally made by himself. Of course, he had spiritual birds and beasts to support him, and he had cultivation, so he did not have to work as hard as normal people. "Is Taoist Chong here?" A voice came from outside, and a cultivator with a round face and short eyebrows came in. He looked very smart, and when he saw Changzai's face, he was very surprised. He clasped his hands and said, "Oh, so Taoist Chong has entered the mystic light realm. Congratulations." However, Changzai said impatiently, "Taoist Jiwei, your appearance is too fake." Jiwei chuckled and said without any awkwardness from being exposed, "Not at all, not at all. I wonder if the feather robe that I want is ready?" Changzai said, "The item that Taoist wants is already prepared." He stretched out his hand and took out a scarlet feathered robe from his belt. This item was crimson in color, and it was adorned with greenish-blue tassels. It was gorgeous and bright, and it had the ability to resist fire and water. He had weaved this item with the help of dozens of spiritual birds, and it took him a lot of effort to weave it. Jiwei took the feather clothing and kneaded it a few times. He felt that it was very tough and couldn't help but say happily, "With this thing, Lady Ji will definitely be satisfied. I can then ask her for a precious bird to be my protector." After being happy for a long time, he patted his head and took out an item from his sleeve. "I used more than 100 days on the cliff to gather over 10,000 silver nest silk." Changzai quickly took it and was also very happy. He thought to himself, "With this, I can start refining a protective magic treasure in the next 2 days." Although he had reached the mystic light realm, he still did not have a protective magic treasure, so he had always wanted to refine one. The other things were already prepared, but he was missing these silver threads. Now, he had finally gathered all of them. These years, because of Taoist Shi, he did not dare to return home and could only communicate by letter. Once the magic treasure was refined, he would no longer have to fear this person. Also, King Bai had imprisoned him for 6 years, so it was time to settle this score. After sending Jiwei off, he closed the cave dwelling, set up the formation flags, and couldn't wait to return to the inner room to refine the magic treasure. 2 months later, there was a clear sound in the cave dwelling, and then a mysterious light rushed out and flew in the direction of the Bai country. Qinghuan Palace in Xianyuan Heaven. In the main hall, Wei Zihong was reporting Chang Zai's recent situation to his teacher. In the end, he said, "Teacher, junior martial brother Han's will in this life is very strong. Junior martial brother Shin and I deliberately left a big enemy for him, but it forced him to improve very quickly. Disciple thinks that junior martial brother Han is a rare seed to seek the Tao. We might as well wait for him to achieve great success and cut off his mortal body before opening his knowledge." Unlike the Wang sisters, Han Zwiqing had cultivated to the Yuanying realm under the supervision of his teacher and fellow disciples in his previous life. Just now, he did not have any desire to seek the Tao and only wanted to live a peaceful life. But in this life, he had suffered a lot before entering the Tao, so his desire to improve was much stronger. Wei Zihong was worried that if the memory of his previous life was restored, he might revert to his old ways. Zhang Yan smiled and shook his head. "What you all hope for is nothing more than for Zwiqing to become the person you all hope for, but you have never thought that if this is the case, he will no longer be himself. As a teacher, I certainly hope to see all of you succeed, but if Zwiqing still wishes to live a peaceful life, then there is nothing wrong with it. With me here, I will not break off the relationship between master and disciple." Wei Zihong bowed and said, "Teacher, this disciple has misunderstood." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "How can I not understand your love for your fellow disciples? I am not a person who does not know how to be flexible. For us cultivators, the foundation is especially important. In the previous life, Zwiqing was already dispirited when he entered the Tao. Later on, even if he wanted to pull himself together, he would not be able to climb up. So this time, I ordered you to go to the lower realm to help him. When his cultivation is gradually successful, you can bring him to me." Chapter 2013. Zhang Yan waited for Wei Zihong to leave before he stood up from his seat and went to the palace platform. He stood with his sleeves behind his back and looked at the myriad of worlds that were gathering and dispersing like the clouds. When the almighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm looked at the present world, what they saw was really a painting scroll, and it was always the same changes. It was no wonder that this generation did not care much about the present world, because to them, these things were not illusory and did not have much meaning to them. He had once thought that if everyone in the world could cultivate, everyone could live forever, and everyone could enjoy the upper realm, that would naturally be good. But in reality, this was impossible. Even if there were endless external things, everyone had their own differences in aptitude. As a Taishang, he had the ability to forcefully promote everyone, but this was like a small pond with countless dragons squeezing into it. Even if the world did not collapse, it was still a pool of stagnant water. The wonderful Tao of the world lay in the word change. If everyone was the same, then there would be no change and there would be no progress. He turned his gaze and looked at Bu Su Tian again. Since the last time the heavenly saint was eliminated, there had been many changes in the past few decades because of the existence's chi activity, but he had managed to solve them one by one. Now, there was still the last bit of the strange force that had not been cleaned up. He had previously sent his disciples to search for it, but they could not find it. It was as if this thing was originally there, but after someone found it, it went somewhere else. He repeatedly calculated and found that these strange forces did not pose a threat to him, and there were many almighty cultivators in Bu Su Tian, so these could be traces left behind by the predecessors, intentionally or unintentionally. If this was the case, unless his cultivation and mana were above all of the predecessors, it would be difficult to completely clean up. However, if he wanted to control Bu Su Tian, he did not have to take all of it. He only had to use the big force to cover the small force. Although this might leave some loose ends, it was the best choice if he could not complete the task. Then, even if the almighty cultivators returned, they would not be able to take the control away from his hands. Kuan-Shi continent. Chang Zixing arrived at the borders of the Bai Kingdom and first went home to meet his parents. When he left home, he was only a child, but now he was a tall and handsome young man. When Chang Dalung husband and wife saw him, at first they did not dare to recognize him, but later on when they saw that it was indeed their own son, they could not help but feeling extremely delighted. Chang Zai discovered that after not seeing them for more than 10 years, his parents did not look old at all and were still in good health. Later on when he asked, he found out that it was someone who sent the pills every month, using him as an excuse. But Chang Dalung was a straightforward man, so he did not take this to heart and had never mentioned it in his letters. Chang Zai thought to himself, this must be the Taoist's care. If I see him again, I must thank him properly. After seeing his parents, he finally felt much more at ease. He stayed in Jia village for more than a month, but he didn't see Taoist Shi looking for him. In reality, this person had not come looking for trouble for many years, so the possibility of him coming here was already very small. However, in order to prevent any accidents, he still left 2 birds here. If he encountered danger, they could carry his parents and fly away from this place. After a few more days, he decided to set off for Baidu. After 6 years of imprisonment, he still had to demand an explanation. Before he left, he specially left behind many gold, pearls, and bronze wares to distribute to the villagers of Jia Mountain. After all, he was not in the village all these years, and Chang Dalung and his wife had relied on the help of these villagers, so he had to repay them. He traveled on the spiritual bird, and after a day, he saw Zhong City in the distance. When he arrived here, he could not help but remember what Shendong had said that day. You must have strength before you can reason. Then as long as you have strength, you can be unreasonable? He originally thought that he could not accept this, because he felt that if he could do this today, then others could do the same to him tomorrow. In that case, speaking reason seemed to be to prevent the weak from being bullied by the strong, because this seemed to be more beneficial to the weak. However, when he thought about it again, he realized that it was not right. It was a joke to expect others to abide by the rules and reason, unless there was a power above them to maintain all of this. And when there was no such power above them, then under normal circumstances, only people with similar strength would pay attention to these because they were wary of each other. Everything he had experienced in these few years proved this logic. He thought to himself, Taoist is right. Now that I have strength, I can come and reason. Just as he was thinking, he suddenly saw a beam of divine light floating in front of him, blocking his path. Then, a jade-faced, golden-robed god with a huge body appeared in front of him. He looked down and said solemnly, "Where did you come from, sir?" Chang Zai realized that the power of this deity was not small. At least he had no confidence in going against him. He guessed that this was the protector god of Baidu country, so he said, "I came here because I have a private matter to attend to." The deity said, "Do you have proof?" Chang Zai was stunned and said, "What proofs?" The deity saw that he did not know, so he explained. As it turned out, as long as one was a cultivator, if they wanted to enter the capital of the countries of human Tao, then they had to leave their name, residence, and even their roots with the local protector god. If they were not willing, they would not be forced, but they would not be allowed to enter. The purpose of this was to prevent cultivators from using their cultivation to stir up trouble in the mortal world. Of course, this was mainly targeted at itinerant cultivators. The disciples of the big sects all had roots, and most of them were very particular about the rules, so they had relatively little to do with the interests of these vassal states. Chang Zai frowned and said, "I'm from Baidu country, do I have to do this too?" He was not afraid of leaving his name, but it was not like Baidu king did not have guards around him. Even though Baidu was dead, his connection with Taoist Shi might not be severed, and it might even be closer. If he told them his name now and they found out in advance, then there might be more twists and turns in this matter. The deity said, "Since you are from Baidu country, why can't you leave your name and master? Moreover, this is a rule set by the divine master, so it cannot be broken." Chang Zai thought about it and turned to leave. The deity looked at his back coldly, but did not stop him. As long as the cultivator did not enter the capital, he would not chase after him and pester him. Chang Zai found a barren hill outside the capital and landed. He thought for a while. With the deity up there, it was obvious that he had no chance of sneaking in, but he actually had a way. Baidu king could not stay in the city forever, especially during the autumn hunt and spring plowing every year. As the ruler of a country, he had to show up. The autumn hunt was a month later, so he just had to wait. After being an itinerant cultivator for a few years, even though this was just a temporary place to stay, he still carefully set up a set of formation flags. At this moment, he did not expect that this action would allow him to avoid a dangerous situation. At midnight, when he was meditating, a sense of danger suddenly surged in his heart, and he could not help but stand up. He saw 3 Taoists dressed differently standing outside, and the one standing in the middle was Taoist Shi. His heart could not help but tighten, and he looked left and right. He discovered that the 2 people beside her were the other 2 cultivators he had seen in the Celestial Palace all those years ago. He quickly reacted and said, "Was it that deity who told you to wait for me here?" Taoist Shi smiled and said, "Changzai, your mistake was taking my disciple's life. He was Baidu King's nephew, and with this kind of relationship, how could the deity let you enter the city? Would he just sit and watch you kill Baidu King?" Changzai shook his head and said, "I didn't plan to kill him." Taoist Shi nodded and said, "I believe that. Even though he imprisoned you for 6 years, it was not a life and death feud, but the deity wouldn't think that way. With you here, how could he feel at ease?" Changzai previously lacked understanding of these gods, and he had always thought that they stood on the right side, but now it seemed that was not the case. They also had selfish motives, and this carelessness had caused his whereabouts to be discovered. He secretly remembered this lesson. Back then, Taoist Shi had suspected that he had been used as a pawn, so he had abandoned his cave and fled. He had even been anxious for a while. Even though no one had come to find him in the past few years, he was still afraid that something might happen, so he had been hiding from Changzai. However, this time was different. He had come under the orders of Baidu King, and he had obtained a righteous title. Even if there was someone behind Changzai, there would be a deity protecting him. At the same time, he also had the thought of borrowing the hand of a god to topple the person behind Changzai. Changzai looked at the 3 people. After reaching the mystic light realm, he had more or less figured out that Taoist Shi's cultivation was similar to his. It would be easy to deal with one person, but he did not have much confidence in facing 3 at the same time. Fortunately, he had prepared for the worst this time. He immediately called out in secret, and the sound of flapping wings came from the sky. He could not help but relax. These 2 birds were not any weaker than him. Who would have thought that at this moment, a screen of light would rise up and immediately block the 2 divine steeds that were flying over? Taoist Shi said indifferently, "Do you think we will not make preparations because we know you have the ability to control beasts? This is the capital. As long as the deity sovereign does not allow it, no beasts or birds can be summoned." Changzai clenched his fists. He had summoned these 2 before, and the deity sovereign had not come to stop them. Now that they had acted when he was about to make his move, it was obvious that they were deliberately targeting him. He was silent for a moment, and then he suddenly sighed. Taoist Shi said, "What? Do you know that you have no chance of winning?" Changzai said calmly, "That is not the case. I am just sighing. Baidu King clearly could not have died, but now he has done this. He has brought about his own destruction. This deity sovereign clearly could have stayed out of this, but now he has jumped in himself. Why bother?" Taoist Shi laughed and said, "Are you still trying to bluff at a time like this?" Changzai didn't say anything more to him. He made a hand seal, and the formation flag below him shook. In an instant, it enveloped himself, Taoist Shi and the other 2. This wasn't 6 years ago, and he was already very familiar with this thing. Formation flag? Taoist Shi was shocked. He did not expect to have such an item on him. Formation flags were also divided into different grades, but the illusion in front of him and the formation chi that spread in all directions was enough to prove that it was a high-grade one. As long as the surrounding spiritual opportunity of the earth veins did not disappear, it could continue to operate. He knew that this was not a situation they could handle. He hurriedly released his artifact to protect himself. At the same time, he shouted, "Please save us, deity sovereign." When the Sir God who was hiding in the dark saw this scene, he was surprised. Just as he was about to attack, he suddenly realized that there was a black-robed Taoist in front of him. The person looked over and said to him, "My junior brother is right. This matter has nothing to do with you, so why did you jump out?" As he spoke, he pointed his finger. The deity sovereign immediately felt a great pressure that was difficult to resist. He could not help but be terrified. He shouted, "I am the deity sovereigns." Before he finished speaking, his whole body suddenly exploded into countless scattered stardust. Wei Zihong retracted his hand and looked at the specks of starlight. He said lightly, "I don't care who you are. Since you mentioned the deity sovereign, I will go to the divine court later and ask him to give me an explanation." Chapter 2014. Without the protection of the Divine Lord, how could Taoist Shi Yi and the other two fight against the suppression of the array flags? Facing the layers of array chi attacks, they couldn't defend themselves even after using all their means. Soon, they were drowned in the onslaught. That was how it worked when itinerant cultivators fought. If you had an extraordinary and powerful move, your opponent wouldn't be able to deal with it. That move could decide the outcome of the battle. Chang Zai saw that the three of them were slowly losing their aura, but he was still worried. He took out his Dharma artifact and attacked them a few more times. After confirming that they were dead, he slowly retracted the array formation. He wiped off his cold sweat. It was really dangerous this time. He was almost tricked by the other party. This also reminded him that no one could be underestimated, especially these rogue cultivators. Since they were able to survive until now, they naturally had their own abilities. Before he could truly overwhelm everyone, it was better to be cautious. He raised his hand and bowed to the front, sincerely thanking him. "Thank you, Taoist, for your help. If not for you, I wouldn't have been able to escape. I would have most likely died here." In the past 6 years, even though Shendong didn't appear again, Wei Zihong had appeared a few times and given him many pointers on cultivation. Otherwise, he wouldn't have advanced so quickly. Just now, at this critical moment, Wei Zihong sent a voice transmission to him and told him to attack. As for the Divine Lord above, he would deal with it. That was also why he dared to go against Taoist Shi Yi and the other two. Wei Zihong smiled and said, "Don't thank me. I've already said that we were from the same sect in our previous life. I'll protect you." In reality, if it wasn't for him and Shendong pushing them from behind, they wouldn't have encountered such a dangerous situation at this time according to the circumstances of this world. Moreover, this kind of unsolvable situation wasn't something that could be salvaged with one person's strength. He would definitely make an appearance. This was also the helplessness of itinerant cultivators. Disciples of major sects always had trump cards, some of which were given by cultivators of the upper realm. Even if they couldn't kill their enemies at the critical moment, they could always escape. But how could itinerant cultivators have those? Even if they had a strong background, it wouldn't be too much beyond their own level. Just like Taoist Shi Yi and the others, they had some tricks, but that was all. Chang Zai said, "Taoist, please wait a moment." He came to the side of Taoist Shi Yi's corpse. The three of them could see that it was already beyond recognition. But even though they were enemies, she was still a cultivator. Even if she died, her corpse shouldn't be exposed to the world like this. She should be buried. However, he suddenly remembered that these two cultivators were the masters of Yuan Dai and Baidong. He had killed their masters, so he did not know how he would face them in the future. He was silent for a moment. Then he flipped his hand, and a mysterious light swept out, burying the two of them underground. Wei Zihong came to his side and said, "Since they want to kill you, there's nothing wrong with you taking their lives. You don't have to worry about it." Chang Zai grunted in acknowledgement. He raised his head and asked, "Taoist Wei, you said you were my senior brother in my previous life. What about Taoist Shin?" Wei Zihong smiled and said, "Didn't fellow Taoist Shin tell you? He was a good friend of yours in your previous life. Seeing that you were trapped in the mortal world, he came to help you." Chang Zai was very curious about his previous life. If he could, he really wanted to ask what kind of person he was and what happened to him in the end. Wei Zihong seemed to see through his thoughts and said, Junior brother, after you return to the sect, you'll be able to recover the memories of your previous life. He then changed the topic. After this matter is over, what plans do you have in the future? Chang Zai thought for a moment and said, in the past, I was afraid that Taoist Shi would cause trouble, so I didn't dare to return home. I was afraid that I would implicate my parents and family. In the future, I should go back to show my filial piety. Wei Zihong said, it's not easy for a wandering cultivator to cultivate. Why don't you bring your parents along and come to my sect to cultivate? Not only will you be able to help each other with the same Tao, it'll also be easier for you to cultivate. Chang Zai's eyes lit up and he said, Taoist, can I bring my parents along? Wei Zihong smiled and said, in my sect, all the clansmen can live there. There are also panaceas to nourish their bodies, so it's much better than living outside. Chang Zai agreed. Although Mount Jiao is located in a remote location, it was still under the control of the Bai Kingdom. Not only did the villagers have to pay taxes, they also had to perform corvée labor every year. Their lives were tough, and if they weren't careful, they might even be attacked by ferocious beasts. But if they were in the sect, they wouldn't have to worry about this anymore. He said, I'm willing to go with Taoist. He paused. There's still the matter of the Bai King. I need to settle this matter. Wei Zihong nodded and said, that's right. Since the Bai King wants to get rid of you, it's reasonable for you to return the favor. Chang Zai bowed and said, Taoist, I'll be back soon. He leaped up and left on the light. Wei Zihong saw that he had left and looked up at the firmament, saying, come out. The firmament shook like a curtain. Then a god came out and bowed to him. He said respectfully, Wei Shangzhen, the divine master already knows about this matter. This time, it's the celestial court's fault for not being strict. I hope that Shangzhen won't be offended. Wei Zihong said, you only brought this message? The god hurriedly said, of course not. Deity Changqing secretly harbored desires and violated the law of heaven. All the gods in his line have been sent to the heavenly prison. Also, this is what the master asked me to pass on to Shangzhen's sect. He took out a beautiful jade box and bowed, presenting it with both hands. The master said that he made a mistake and will personally go to the Grand Elder and a few Yuan Zun to ask for forgiveness. At this moment, he was secretly blaming deity Changqing for causing such a mess. He thought that everything he did was within the rules and no one would say anything wrong. However, he didn't know that the rules were set by people. Most importantly, there were more rules above the rules. If it was someone else, it would be fine if they offended him. But this time, it just had to be someone from the Tao Ancestors sect. Even if his body and soul were to be destroyed, it would be his own doing. No one would dare to stand up for him. Wei Zihong took the jade box and said, since that's the case, you can go. There were indeed many good things in the jade box, but he didn't care. As the sect master of a sect, how could he lack such things? Now that he accepted it, it meant that this matter had come to an end. Within the capital, the throne hall was in a state of panic. Because a moment ago, the spirit tablet that was worshipped in the hall suddenly shattered. Even the statue of the deity collapsed, and there was no longer any response. Not only that, although there were still mountain deities and river deities inside and outside the capital, they seemed to have disappeared at this moment. Not a single one of them showed themselves. The Bai King was also panicking. If the protector deity was not here, then the Bai country would no longer have the power to control cultivators and ferocious beasts. He hurriedly went up the altar and prayed to the heavens. However, at this moment, a beam of light suddenly came and landed on the back of the Bai King. He swayed, and in an instant, his soul was dragged out. Instantly, his breath disappeared, and he fell stiffly on the ground. The attendants below didn't discover it at first, but after a long time, seeing that there was no movement on the platform and there was no response after calling out a few times, a palace attendant went up to check. Then, a mournful voice sounded. The king has died. And at this time, Chang Zai had already gone back to fetch his parents. Together with Wei Zihong, they rode the cloud raft to the base of the Yaoyin clan in the Kunshe continent. 2 days later, the large raft arrived on a floating island that was covered in wind and clouds. Immediately, an elder came out and bowed. "Greetings, sect master." Wei Zihong nodded, waved his hand to dismiss them, and went inside with Chang Zai. Chang Zai looked around curiously and was surprised to find that there were many demon cultivators here. As far as he knew, many sects wouldn't accept foreign species. Wei Zihong smiled and said, "There are many demon cultivators and foreign species in my Yaoyin sect. If Junior Brother doesn't like to deal with them, you can arrange a separate cave residence for cultivation." Chang Zai didn't feel uncomfortable. After all, he often dealt with birds and beasts, but this didn't mean that he was friendly to these foreign species. In the wilderness, the biggest threat to him were also these creatures. After all, he didn't have the ability to control those demons with spiritual intelligence. For foreign species that were too much beyond his realm, if they posed a threat to him, he thought it was better to get rid of them as soon as possible. Not long after, the cloud raft stopped on a flying peak. Wei Zihong said, "Junior Brother, from now on, this is where you will cultivate. There are more than 1,000 attendants on this peak at your disposal. You can stay here first, and when the time is right, I will take you to see Master." Xianyuan Heaven, Qinghuan Palace. Zhang Yan was deducing on the platform. Since the last time he came out of the dragon domain, he had calculated that within 100 years, another chaotic heaven would appear. But as the time was getting closer and closer and there were more and more restrictions on Bushutian, he found that he could take the initiative to cross over and didn't have to wait here. After the calculation was confirmed to be feasible, he changed his mind and sank his consciousness inside. In just a flash, he appeared in a different world. However, there was a slight deviation in his perception. After a further investigation, he found that this was not the world he wanted to go to. He thought about it. If there was no accident, it was likely that the world had avoided him. But since he was here, this was a place where the chaotic heaven was, so he took the opportunity to take a look. He checked. Although the spiritual vigor here was flourishing, it was still declining. This was because the celestial sphere and the Bu Su heaven had separated and merged. Now, this place was heading towards the Bu Su heaven and had not truly landed on it. When the two merged, it would return to its original state. Therefore, the celestial sphere was attached to the Bu Su heaven. If there was no intersection with the Bu Su heaven, then these lands would not exist for long. He tried to look at the past of this world, but found that, like the dragon domain, there was also a layer of obstruction. And this place could be said to be barren. Apart from the spiritual opportunity mountains and rivers, it could be said that there were no living creatures. Because he still couldn't see the past, he didn't know whether this world was barren or only appeared when it merged with Bushutian. He thought about it. It seemed that according to the right path, unless he was willing to continue to wait here, there would be no harvest. But there was another option here, and that was to ask the world itself. Just as the dragon domain was originally formed by a big dragon, this place was also not simple. His eyes flashed slightly, and in an instant, the whole world suddenly changed in his eyes, turning into something that was neither strange nor mysterious. It looked like a stomach that was slowly squirming there. Chapter 2015. Zhang Yan looked at the thing and felt that it seemed to be able to transform everything in the world. He had seen similar creatures in the past, but this monster's level was obviously far above them, and it seemed to be in a deep sleep. As he watched, the big bag slowly woke up and transformed into a tall man. He cupped his hands and bowed, saying, "Greetings, Supreme One." Zhang Yan asked, "How should I address you?" The man said, "My name is Tao Wu. I was originally the belly of a big trout." When Zhang Yan heard the name, Big Trout, all the details about this thing flowed through his mind in an instant. Big Trout was the manifestation of a certain form in the chaos. It looked like a fish, but it had no hands and feet. It was born with the ability to devour everything in the world. Every time it grew, it meant that a part of everything had turned into nothingness. Later on, in order to stop this trend, there was an almighty predecessor who killed it and split it into several parts, each of which turned into a chaotic sky. This way, not only could it be used, but it could also be used by the endless whaley of the heavens to restrain it. Zhang Yan asked, Is there anyone living in this world? Tao Wu said embarrassedly, reporting to Supreme One, I don't know either. Perhaps there is someone, perhaps there is no one. Zhang Yan looked at him for a moment and nodded slightly. He understood that this was a trick left behind by that predecessor. If a figure at his level of cultivation arrived, then this monster would awaken, and if he left, then it would once again fall into a deep slumber. During this period of time, it would be unaware of anything. Tao Wu bowed and said, the predecessor who separated the big trout's body once said that if I wake up again, then the big trout's divine will also awaken, and we will have the possibility of reuniting in one place. Only someone that I can see can solve this matter. Now that Supreme One is here, I hope that Supreme One will have mercy on me and help me. As long as I pass through this, I will be at your disposal in the future. If it wasn't for the former almighty being separating Big Trout, he wouldn't have been born. From this point of view, he didn't want to be merged back. That would mean that he wouldn't exist anymore. Zhang Yan couldn't help but fall into deep thought. Judging from the traces left behind by that sage, he should be at the same level as he was, so it should be impossible for him to deduce how he did things or even know that he would come here. The reason why he gave such an order to Tao Wu was probably because only the Spirit Refinement Almighty could stop the big trout from merging. Originally, it did not matter to him whether or not the big trout fused together. It did not pose a threat to him either. Back then, the Almighty could separate them, so it was not difficult for him to do the same. However, he had to consider that the stimulation of the vital energy of that existence had caused numerous unexpected changes to occur in Bushutian. If this thing was similarly affected by it, then the outcome would be different, and it would be sufficient to cause great trouble for him. Now, he was at the final juncture of controlling Bushutian, and he could not allow such an accident to occur. At that moment, he had already understood something. This time, he didn't enter this muddy sky for no reason, but Bushutian and him corresponded. Just now, he landed here to eliminate this hidden danger. He calculated that the merging of the big trout was an inevitable trend. Once it was separated, there would be a day when it would reunite. In other words, this process was actually ongoing, but it was delayed by the means of that almighty being. Even if he destroyed this muddy sky, it would not be able to stop it. Because if the big trout was missing other parts, as long as there was a bit left, it would still be able to fill in the missing parts. From this point of view, if he killed the Tao Wu in front of him, he would be helping it instead. Therefore, he could either kill the remaining spirit of the big trout in one go, or use his own mana to continue to suppress it and delay its recovery indefinitely. Only then could he solve this problem. However, that existence had already caused a lot of trouble even before it arrived. When it truly appeared, it was unknown what would happen. Therefore, delaying it was obviously not advisable. Zhang Yan thought for a while. Back then, that almighty being had divided the big trout into 5 parts: the head, abdomen, legs, neck, and tail. If he wanted to suppress the spirit of the spirit, then he had to find the other parts. However, there was a problem. Before those muddy skies came close to Bushutian, he might not be able to find them. Fortunately, there was a way here. Tao Wu was the belly of the big trout, and when they got close to each other, they were actually connected to the other parts. Therefore, as long as he followed this carefully, he should be able to find the other parts one by one. However, this matter could not be done by him, because his own level was too high. Back then, that sage could divide this monster into 5 parts, and he could do the same. Therefore, even if the other parts had the same thoughts as Tao Wu, out of instinctive fear, they would definitely try to avoid it. Moreover, this generation might not necessarily be of one mind. Therefore, he needed to find 5 people who were closely related to him and had karmic connections with this consciousness incarnation. He would first send them to Tao Wu's place, then to the remaining parts of the big trout. Once they landed there, he would be able to find the big trout's spirit and suppress it. From the looks of it, only his own sect's disciples were the most suitable. Originally, it was fine if they were not from his sect, but this was related to his plan to control Bushutian, so the people he sent had to be from his own sect. If he sent someone else, it might implicate his own patriarch, or the power of his patriarch, or some unknown Wei, which would be a hindrance to him. Of course, it was also an option to send someone from Chinsong School, but the problem was that the great underworld patriarch was nowhere to be found, and there had been no response. Therefore, it was better for him to take the lead himself. At least, he had already succeeded half of the time. Once this matter was settled, he would be close to controlling Bu Shutian. Currently, under his sect, Lu Yenyi, Wei Zihong, Jiang Zheng, and Yuan Jianqing had all severed their mortal bodies, but he was still missing one person. The second disciple, Tian Kuan, had a chance to succeed, but he was still in seclusion. He knew that although this disciple had not made a move for a long time, it was not because he had encountered difficulties, but because he was too focused on stability. He did not know that this was the last step, and he needed to have the determination to give up everything. When he could see through this layer, he would be able to succeed. He decided that this matter could wait for a while. After this disciple came out of seclusion, he would start to make arrangements. Clear Phoenix Valley. This was the base of Blue Feather Pavilion in the Kunshe continent. Sect Master Han Xiaoda had handed over the sect's affairs to the sect elders, and he spent most of his time cultivating here. A few days ago, he heard that his biological father, Han Zwicheng, had reincarnated and had re-entered the Tao, and he had mixed feelings. For cultivators, the only thing that could not be severed was the relationship between master and disciple. This was because after a cultivator reincarnated, only the master and disciple would take care of each other for several lifetimes or even dozens of lifetimes. Of course, if a cultivator only had one family and one surname, then the reincarnated person would be brought back into the sect, and the sect would take care of everything. It was not necessarily a fixed master. But no matter what the situation was, once this life was over, then the relationship between them would no longer exist. Han Xiaoda was only the son of Han Zwicheng, and he had nothing to do with the current Chang Zai, even if the latter picked up the memories of his previous life. However, Han Zwicheng had left many things behind in the past, and this still belonged to Chang Zai. Since the original owner had returned, he should not keep it in his hands anymore. He immediately summoned a trusted clansman, handed him a sleeve bag and said, "These were left behind by my father in the past. Now that he has reincarnated, go to the Yaoyin clan base and send these to him." The clansman bowed and said yes, and then put on the sleeve bag and went to the Yaoyin clan. These days, Chang Zai had been cultivating on the Flying Peak, and he felt the benefits of being in the sect. Being here, he no longer had to worry about the outside monsters attacking him, and he did not have to guard against the scheming of his fellow cultivators. But other than cultivating, he did not really have nothing to do. For example, he needed to be responsible for raising spirit birds and beasts for the Yaoyin clan. Regarding this, he did not feel that it was inappropriate. Although Wei Zihong said that he were brothers in the previous life, that was the previous life, after all. In this life, he had not returned to the clan, so he could not treat it like that. Therefore, he did not want to accept too many favors, and was very willing to do some things for the Yaoyin clan. It was just that whenever he tried to find out who Wei Zihong and his master in the previous life were, the people around him would not say a word. But he finally found out that Wei Zihong was a mighty person who had severed his mortal body, so he boldly guessed that this master could be a certain Yuan Zun. On this day, when he finished his homework and was preparing to go to the spirit garden, he was told that a Taoist had come to visit. Out of curiosity, he invited the person in. The Taoist came in, bowed, and handed over the item in his hand, saying, "Under the orders of the clan leader, I have specially brought this item to your hands." Chang Zai asked curiously, "Who is the clan leader? And what is this item? Why are you giving it to me?" The Taoist said, "It is not convenient for me to say, but these items were used by you in your previous life, so this time, it can be considered as returning them to their rightful owner." "Is it an item from my previous life?" Chang Zai could not help but be shocked. In the Yaoyin clan, he was not afraid of the other deceiving him. He took the sleeve, cupped his hands, and said, "Thank you, Taoist." The Taoist did not say anything more, bowed, and said goodbye. Chang Zai had wanted to ask more about his previous life, but seeing that the Taoist did not want to say more, he could only let him go. He dismissed the servants, returned to the inner room, and tried to open the sleeve, only to discover that there were several layers inside, and only one of them could be opened by him. Thus, he took out all the items inside, and his eyes couldn't help but light up. There were a few Dharma treasures that Ming-Chi and Mystic Light realms could use, as well as elixirs, secret scrolls, and even protective robes. Although the Yaoyin clan also had such items, and if he wanted them, it would not be difficult, but in the end, it was because of Wei Zihong, and he did not have to worry so much if he wanted to use an item from his previous life. At this time, he noticed a golden flood dragon wood sculpture. Every scale was exquisitely carved, and could be said to be lifelike. For some reason, among so many things, he felt that this item was the most important. He picked up the item and looked closely, and found that there was a faint sound of breathing inside, as if there was some living creature sleeping inside, and a sense of familiarity rose in his heart. Under the push of an inexplicable feeling, he reached out and pressed on the back of the golden flood dragon, and instantly, a golden light shone in front of him. Chapter 2016. Ao Tong woke up from his slumber and shook his body. He let out a loud laugh and said, "Old Ao, I'm back again." But he suddenly realized that someone was looking at him from above, and his body stiffened. After a while, he stared back fiercely. If one disregarded his body that was only half a foot long, he did look quite imposing. Chang Zai also looked at this pocket-sized flood dragon in a daze. The two of them stared at each other for a while, and Chang Zai asked carefully, "How should I address you, fellow Taoist?" Ao Tong wagged his tail and straightened his upper body, and then he puffed out his chest and said, "My name is Ao Tong. Since you're able to awaken me, then you're that good friend of mine? The reincarnation?" Chang Zai was a little unsure and said, "It should be Little Ku." He added, "The place where fellow Taoist resides was sent over by an unknown Taoist. He said that it was returned to its original owner." Ao Tong pouted and said, "That's you." Even though Chang Zai had never heard of Ao Tong's name, he felt inexplicably close to this little flood dragon, as though he had known it for a long time. He asked curiously, "Fellow Taoist Ao Tong, are you a golden flood dragon? Why are you so small?" Ao Tong coughed and pretended to be indifferent. "It's nothing. I slept for a long time, so I naturally became smaller. Haven't I heard that we flood dragons can be big or small, can hide or hide, and are good at many transformations?" Even though flood dragons had long lifespans, they were far inferior to true dragons. Back then, Han Zhuqing had a deep friendship with him, so he had personally gone to Clear Feather Sect to visit Tao Jinhong. He asked for a hypnosis technique for Han Zhuqing that could turn fake death into cultivation. In the future, if Han Zhuqing could reincarnate and enter Tao again, he would be able to wake him up as well. However, this did not come without a price. Gaining lifespan meant losing its original power. However, with this cultivation method, it was not impossible for one to become a true dragon in the future. Thus, the gains and losses here were difficult to determine. Chang Zai made a sound of acknowledgement. He thought that dragons were good at transformations. Even though flood dragons were slightly inferior, they might also have this kind of supernatural power. He must have seen too little and made a fuss over nothing. Ao Tong leapt up and landed on the brush rack. He looked around and asked, "What is your name in this world, and where is this place?" Chang Zai replied, "I am Chang Zai. This is the Yaoyin clan." Ao Tong thought for a moment and said, "That's sect leader Wei's territory." Very good, very good." His expression relaxed a lot. Right now, he did not have much magic power. What he was most afraid of was Chang Zai waking him up in an unprotected place. If that happened, he would not be able to stop her no matter what accident he encountered. But when he heard that they were in the Yaoyin clan's encampment, he was relieved. Chang Zai asked curiously, "Were you an old acquaintance of mine in my previous life?" Ao Tong said proudly, "Of course. At that time, you listened to everything I said, and many of your skills were learned from me. Although your predecessor and I were friends, we were also half teacher and half friend." Chang Zai was filled with deep veneration. He cupped his hands and said, "In that case, Senior Ao is also considered half a teacher of mine?" Teacher? Ao Tong was shocked. He looked around guiltily and swallowed his saliva. He said, "I can't call you that," he muttered in his heart, pretending to be a teacher. If old master finds out, old Ao's small body won't be able to take it. Chang Zai said, "Senior Ao, can you tell me what kind of person I was in my previous life?" Ao Tong was stunned. He said, "No one told you before?" Chang Zai shook his head. No one was willing to say much. Ao Tong's eyeballs turned. He said, "Let bygones be bygones. Why are you so stubborn? No matter how you were in your previous life, what does it have to do with this life?" Chang Zai sighed. "But when I regain my memory, I'll be able to remember the past. How can it not have anything to do with me? I think I must not have been a likable person in my previous life. I've never done anything commendable or made any mistakes. Otherwise, I wouldn't have avoided mentioning them." Ao Tong blew his beard and glared. "You can think about that when you arrive. Besides, if you were really a bad person in your previous life, why would I, old Ao, be friends with you? Doesn't that mean that I, old Ao, am not a good person?" Chang Zai was startled. He thought about it and then laughed, saying, "You're right, I'm too stubborn. Now that things have yet to come, there's no need to worry about it. I'll think about it when I'm awake." He bowed to Ao Tong again. "I'll have to ask for Senior Ao's guidance in the future." Ao Tong was puzzled. "Why, Sect Master Wei is not willing to teach you?" Chang Zai shook his head. "Sect Master Wei is a sect master after all. Besides, I haven't awakened my memory. It's not good to keep bothering him." Although Wei Zihong had told him that if he wasn't around he could ask any of the elders in the sect. However, there was a layer of distance between him and those elders, so he didn't want to disturb them. Ao Tong did not dare to give pointers carelessly. His cultivation method was different from Chang Zai's. He thought about it and asked, "What's the situation in the outside world now?" Ever since Han Zwicheng was reincarnated, he had gradually fallen into a deep sleep and did not know what had happened in the outside world. Chang Zai was just now a disciple. His knowledge was also extremely limited. He only knew which sects were around. The upper sect was Chinsong School. As for the rest, he did not know much and could not care less. Therefore, he only told him what he knew. Ao Tong felt that the outside world had not changed much since he fell into a deep sleep. However, he knew that there must be something different. He said, "Do you have an identity token?" "Old Ao, I'll go out and take a look. Maybe I can find someone to teach you." Chang Zai thought about it and said, "I can't give Senior Ao the token, but there are quite a number of servant tokens on the mountain. I'm afraid that it will inconvenience Senior. If Senior is willing to wait, I can ask the elders in the sect for one." Ao Tong said indifferently, "It's fine. Just give it to me." The token was only for convenience when he went out. When he saw Wei Zihong, what kind of token couldn't he get? Chang Zai said, "Wait a moment, Senior." He turned and went out. After a while, he came back with a token. Ao Tong opened his mouth and swallowed, and the enormous talisman was put away by him. He said, "Just wait for my good news." As he spoke, he transformed into a golden ray of light that vanished without a trace. Clear nether heavenly lake, in Han Mo's cave. Tian Kuan sat on the praying mat. The qi activity that he had emitted since his seclusion had actually gathered into a black jade mountain, enveloping him within. His cultivation had long reached the final stage. He only needed to find his own root fruit and he could cast off his mortal body. However, he always felt that it would be difficult to ensure his own safety if he went like this. Therefore, every time before he wanted to act, he would try to calculate and make sure nothing went wrong. However, he discovered that he was unable to cover up all the loopholes. There were always some places that he didn't have time to attend to, so he didn't take this step for a long time. This was just as Zhang Yan had deduced. It wasn't that his cultivation wasn't good, but he really sought too much stability. He always thought that he could succeed as long as he went forward by himself. However, this stage usually required cultivators to give up everything and sever their mortal bodies with a fearless heart. Only then could they ascend to the upper realm in one go. Just like Jiang Jing, he dared to give up everything and unite his heart with Tao, so he could enter the upper realm. However, it couldn't be said that Tian Kuan's actions were wrong, as he himself had vaguely sensed this point. However, if one didn't have the heart to abandon everything and forcefully pass the test, then one would instead be dragged down by it. This wasn't just his own body, it was the dust technique he cultivated. It had always been based on one's own body before seeking the other. Moreover, during the process of cultivation, his cultivation technique and temperament would affect each other, causing them to be compatible with each other. So now he was competing with himself, and only by passing this barrier in his heart would he have a chance of success. Moreover, after he found out that he had the support of this item, he would have a way out, and the obstruction in his heart would disappear along with it, and it wouldn't be a hindrance any longer. In fact, this could be regarded as a heart-grinding stone. If he didn't comply with the technique and forcefully crossed it, then the surrounding hard stone might not be as firm and stable as it was now, and it was very likely that it wouldn't be able to protect him. Only when he had reached this juncture and accumulated enough strength would he be able to achieve both ends. Because he had let go of his thoughts, there was no longer anything holding him back, and he no longer hesitated. He immediately let go of everything, focused his mind, and went to seek the Taoist technique. The next moment, there was a loud bang, and the surrounding jade mountain suddenly turned into countless tiny smoke and dust, but it didn't affect the outside at all. Even the insects, ants, grass, and trees close to the cave residence weren't disturbed in the slightest. Amidst the rolling dust, only a voice could be heard: "Hold the spirit-containing pearl for 2 lifetimes, temper the books of future generations, wash away the filth in your heart, cast away the old body, and from now on, there is no difference between heaven and man." As the voice faded, a thick yellow light grew and shrank, collecting all the scattered dust. A Taoist walked out, looked at the sky, and instantly turned into a ray of light, flying toward Xianyuan heaven. Chapter 2017. Before Tian Kuan succeeded, Zhang Yan had already sensed it. He pondered for a while and sent out a talisman, ordering the 4 disciples to come to Qinghuan Palace. Not long after, a clear light soared into the sky. Lu Yenyi, Jiang Jing, Wei Zihong, Yuan Zhangqing, and the other disciples all came to the hall. When they came to their seats, they all bowed and said, "Disciple pays respect to master." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Dispense with the formalities. Tian Kuan will succeed soon. All of you wait here." When the disciples heard this news, they looked at each other and couldn't help but feel happy. Tian Kuan had been silent for too long. Seeing that his life was coming to an end, everyone was a little worried. Now that he succeeded, they were all happy for him. Not long after, Jingyu entered the hall and reported, "Master, Tian Shang is really here." Zhang Yan said, "Call him in." After a while, Tian Kuan strode into the hall. When he reached the steps, he came up and bowed, saying in a deep voice, "Disciple pays respect to master. Disciple congratulates master for his success." He had been in seclusion for a long time and didn't know much about the outside world. However, when he arrived at the door of the hall, Jingyu told him that his master had already transcended this world and should be addressed as Grand Supreme. He was shocked and excited. Zhang Yan said in a gratified tone, "You were able to succeed this time because you comprehended the key to the last stage in time. You didn't waste your life's cultivation." Tian Kuan bowed again and said, "Disciple is ashamed. Thank you for your concern, master." Lu Yenyi smiled and said, "Congratulations, junior apprentice brother." Jiang Zheng, Wei Zihong, Yuan Zhangqing, and the others all came up and bowed, saying, "Congratulations, senior apprentice brother." Tian Kuan bowed back to them one by one. He was happy when he achieved Tao, but it was only a moment of venting. At this moment, he had already calmed down and returned to his previous calmness. From then on, 5 disciples under Xianyuan school achieved mortal transformation. In the past, this was completely unimaginable in the 9 continents. However, because the mountain and sea realm was rich in spiritual energy, and because Zhang Yan had unleashed numerous divine abilities, It was now much easier for Taoist cultivators to achieve their goals. However, at the same time, the barrier of one's temperament still obstructed many people. As a result, there weren't many people in the younger generation who were able to break through. On the contrary, the upper realm cultivators who had participated in the Great War of the 9 provinces and followed the Qinsong and Shaoqing sects to the mountain and sea realm would often be able to break through their original limits. Over the years, most of the people who had broken through came from these people. Zhang Yan felt very gratified. As a prime Dao patriarch, it didn't seem like much of a surprise that his disciples had reached this level. However, he knew that other than giving them guidance in their techniques, and even providing them with medicinal ingredients, he hadn't given them any extra help in improving their magical power. Without his own hard work, it would have been impossible for them to achieve what they had today. One disciple after another from Shenyuan school had broken through to mortal transformation, and could be considered to be quite powerful. However, considering the mountain and sea realm as a whole, it had only been a short time since it had been built up. Although it didn't have the almighty experts at its peak, it still couldn't compare to the Yuhuan heavens, which had flourished for millions of years. Second elder brother, Wei Zihong said, "You don't know this, but before you emerged from secluded meditation, my elder sisters and junior brothers returned to the realm of clear serenity. Once they return with success, the sect of clear serenity will return to its former glory." My junior brothers and junior sisters are back? Tian Kuan sighed inwardly. Cultivating the Tao was a timeless thing. His secluded meditation had caused many changes in the world, and yet, the camaraderie between his fellow disciples hadn't faded. As their elder brother, he thought to himself, I haven't taken much care of them in the past. Now that I've emerged from secluded meditation, I should pay them a visit. Lu Yenny guessed that the reason her master had called all 5 of them here was because he had something important to tell them. It wasn't just because of Tian Kuan's success. After a brief conversation with her fellow disciples, she clasped hands and said, "Honored master, why have you called me and my junior brothers here? Is there something you need to tell us?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Today, I have something I need you to do." Lu Yenny said seriously, "Please instruct us, honored master." Zhang Yan directed with his mind. Spiritual light spilled out from the hall, and the scenery inside turned. He used this to show the origin of the realm of chaos and the image of the great trout in front of the disciples. He said, "This great trout has the ability to devour existences." An almighty person of the past saw this and divided it into 5 parts, each part opening up a realm of chaos. Now, it's showing signs of mending. If it were during normal times, we wouldn't have to care about it. However, once this thing comes back to life, it may be triggered by the Weili from beyond the heavens, which will hinder one of my great plans. Therefore, it needs to be returned to the divine will and destroyed first. However, due to the obstruction of that almighty Weili, if I go there, I won't be able to leave no traces behind. The remnants of the great trout will definitely try their best to avoid me. If you go there, you won't alarm them. Lu Yenny said with a serious expression, "I understand. However, what should I do when I go there? Please instruct me, honored master." Zhang Yan said, "When you arrive at the realm of chaos, you only need to fall into it and protect yourself. You don't need to do anything unnecessary. I can use karma to guide you and get rid of this hidden danger." Pausing for a moment, he continued, "Because all of you have different cultivations and the 5 remnant bodies are different. In order to avoid interfering, you will enter one after the other. Once all of you are in place, I will activate the technique. The person who arrives first must protect himself to avoid being invaded by external forces. Remember this." He then explained in detail some things that must be kept in mind. Then, he shook his sleeves and opened up a light screen in the hall. "You can go in here." The 5 disciples bowed to their master and walked into the light screen. In a flash, they arrived at the place where Tao Wu was. To prevent himself from being unable to find this place after leaving Tao Wu, Zhang Yan's consciousness had been immersed here and didn't leave. When the disciples arrived, he said, "Jiang Zheng, guard this place. The rest can go to the other heavens as just now said." Lu Yenyi and the other disciples received the order. After sensing for a while, they found the other places. After a while, they disappeared from their original places. When Zhang Yan saw that they had left along the path, he said to Jiang Zheng, who was left alone, "If I were here, Tao Wu wouldn't have fallen into a deep sleep, and the great trout's divine will wouldn't have appeared. I will leave in a while. You are still in charge of this place. Among my disciples, your Tao heart is the strongest. I feel the most at ease leaving this place to you." Jiang Zheng said, "Disciple will not disappoint honored master." After Zhang Yan gave his instructions, his figure slowly faded away. After a while, he completely disappeared. Jiang Zheng bowed to the place where he disappeared and sat down cross-legged, waiting with rapt attention. Lu Yan's heart moved according to her will. In a flash, she found herself in an even more unfamiliar place. She stretched out her slender fingers and channeled her mana. A drop of clear water condensed on her fingertip and turned into a flat mirror. In a flash, some scenery was reflected in it. This was the true reflection technique of the Northern Underworld True Water Secret Technique. Through this technique, one could see the world and see the truth directly, and not be confused by external things. At this moment, she saw that the entire world here was actually a huge head. It should be the head of the great trout that her master had mentioned. She couldn't help but admire the wonders of creation and the majesty of the universe. However, although she saw this thing, due to the difference in level between the two, she actually couldn't come into contact with it. Hence, she removed the technique and let the water mirror break. Looking up, not far in front of her was a magnificent temple, but it was extremely dilapidated. There used to be people staying there, but now there was no trace of anyone. She sensed that it wasn't just here. In the entire heavenly realm, other than her, there was no other cultivator left. Even the living creatures were only left with some plants. She walked up the stairs and passed by the empty front hall and main hall. Finally, she came to the back hall with half of the roof collapsed. Under the starlight, there were a few memorial tablets placed there, but the words on them were already blurred and difficult to read. She channeled her mana and tried to deduce the past, but there was a layer of Wei blocking her. She couldn't do it, so she gave up. After looking around for a while, she saw that under the sacrificial table at the highest point, there were a few jade scrolls. They were also the only intact things in this place. She reached out and grabbed it and pulled it over. Her consciousness entered it, and she saw that the temple recorded the life of the owner of the memorial tablets. However, there were many gaps, but from the records, it could be seen that this person had cut off his past and future body. However, the last record said that this person had died at the end of his lifespan. Her heart trembled slightly. Such a person should have lived to the end of his lifespan, but he died like a mortal. This was undoubtedly related to the head of the giant trout. However, at this moment, she suddenly realized that the scenery in front of her had changed. She was shocked to find that she had actually landed in her own Lingbo small world. She felt the chi dynamic on her body, but it had returned to before she had cut off her mortal body. She did not panic because of this. Regarding such a situation, she had heard from Zhang Yan beforehand that the head of the giant trout was undoubtedly still in a deep sleep. It would only reject people who might cause harm to its body. At this moment, she should have fallen into the will of the god. If she wanted to go out, she could not deliberately resist. Otherwise, due to the difference between the two sides, the pressure from this world would only increase. Thus, she could only follow its will and try to not let herself be taken away. When all the people of the same sect had gone to where they should go, she would naturally be able to escape. She immediately sat down with determination and guarded her mind. The Wei continued to invade at this moment, but it was urging her to break through the realm faster. She had a feeling that if she could not pass this stage, then what she would face was not death, but the regression of her cultivation. If she continued to fail, then she would return to being a mortal. When she came out of the god's will, perhaps this place would turn from illusion to reality. Because her foundation was firm, she did not pass through the upper realm by luck. Right now, it was just a repeat of what happened that day. Thus, without hesitation, she stepped through this door in an instant, and regained her cultivation. However, she had just passed through this stage, and in just an instant she found herself back to the state just now. She frowned. It should be known that every time a cultivator climbed to the upper realm, it depended on themselves and a certain amount of luck. Thus, if she were to start all over again, she might not be able to pass through safely. She was confident that she could pass through it once or twice, but she might not be able to pass through hundreds or thousands of times. If she were to go back and forth endlessly, then there would ultimately be one failure. She could not help but think of the owner of the memorial tablet. Perhaps he had also died because of this. Thus, if she did not think of a way here, it might be difficult for her to persevere to the end. Chapter 2018. Lu Yinyi thought about it and came up with a solution. She noticed that after she broke through, the gods would not return her immediately, but there would be a gap that was neither too long nor too short, and that would be an opportunity that she could make use of. She was already close to the second stage and could enter this barrier anytime, so after she re-entered the first stage, if she did not stop and directly advance to the second stage, would she be able to avoid falling back? If she could successfully pass through, even if she fell back, she would only return to the first stage, and it would not be too much of a loss to her. The most important thing was that breaking through to the next stage was usually the most dangerous, especially going from the heavenly abode to the mortal molting, severing the mortal body and ending the karma. The cultivator would then leap into a brand new world. If it was a breakthrough within the same stage, even if she failed, the damage she would suffer would be relatively small. If this method was feasible, then it would turn the disadvantages into advantages. She would be able to comprehend the various changes in the second stage, and she might even be able to achieve this when she came out. Thinking of this, she made up her mind. As she broke through the barrier again, she did not hesitate to advance to the next stage. As she expected, as long as she tried to advance, there would be no external force to stop her, and she would not return to her previous state. But at the same time, if she failed to break through, it would probably lead to the same consequences as in the real world. It was not difficult for a mortal molting cultivator to enter the second stage, as long as she had accumulated enough cultivation, had no lack of external medicine, and had no other areas that needed polishing, then she could advance in a short period of time. Therefore, this barrier did not pose much of an obstacle to her, and she only felt that this door was easily pushed open. But before she could experience it for a long time, the gods will urged her to continue moving forward. But the third stage was to sever the body of the past and future, and it was the most difficult barrier. With her current cultivation base, it was not enough to cross over, and she did not do so. After a while, she allowed the force to drag her back. In an instant, she realized that she had once again entered the first stage of the mortal molting realm, but this was already within her expectations, and she could not help but smile. As long as she maintained this barrier, then there would be room for advancement and retreat, and she would not be beaten down to the mortal world again. The place Tian Kun was heading to was the giant trout's neck. He followed that feeling and immersed himself in it. According to Zhang Yan's instructions, if everything went smoothly, they would be able to reach that place in the blink of an eye. However, they might run into some trouble afterwards. There was also the possibility that they would not be able to reach that place and would meet with an accident on the way. Now, he was in the latter situation. He found himself repeatedly walking back and forth in an empty world, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not reach the place where he was supposed to go. He wasn't sure if there was a past or a future here, or how far he had traveled. He still remembered that Zhang Yan had said that they would only start taking action after all the disciples had arrived at their destination, and they would have to bear the pressure from before. However, the problem was that he was not alone now. He was shouldering the lives of his fellow disciples. If he could not go to muddy heaven for a long time, he was likely to be a burden to his fellow disciples. It might even cause his teacher's plan to fail. Fortunately, he was very patient. When he was breaking through to mortal metamorphosis, even though he was about to reach the end of his lifespan, he did not advance at all. Therefore, he was not anxious at all at this time. He was secretly thinking about how he could escape from here and find the real place. His teacher was the Taishang Taoist ancestor, and he would not be wrong about the mystery. Since he was sent here, there must be a way to break through this obstacle. It was just that he had not found the right way yet. Up until now, he had been following the chi activity. However, what if he changed the direction and retreated? He tried it and found that he could not do it. Obviously, he could not use a simple method of advancing and retreating to break through. However, he did not count on it and only tried it. Could it be that he had already reached this muddy heaven, but his senses were wrong? He used the technique that Zhang Yan had given him to carefully examine it, and found that it was not the case. He had indeed not reached that place yet. After rejecting one idea after another, he felt that since he could not find a way outside, he might as well look inside. Therefore, he turned his thoughts to himself. After entering mortal metamorphosis, the biggest difference from before was the usage of the divine will. No matter how much time passed in the divine will, to the outside world, it was just an instant. Then, he could try to deduce a correct path from it. However, to do so, he would need to expend his own vitality. Fortunately, he had brought along a lot of Ziqing medicine when he came. Moreover, he had just now breaking realm, his chi was flourishing and he was on the rise. As he continued to deduce, his vitality decreased bit by bit. However, he did not care and was still determined. After an unknown period of time, he had used up all the medicine on him, and his vitality was also gradually depleted. However, even at this moment, he did not have any hesitation or pause. It was as if once he had decided on a path, he must walk it to the end, and vowed not to turn back until he saw the result. At the last moment, the divine will suddenly shook, and the surrounding mysteriously shattered. He realized that he was already standing in a world. Not only did his vitality and mana recover, he even faintly increased by a level. He could not help but calm down. This experience had already confirmed what he was thinking just now. In this world, life was death, death was life. Of course, if he did not have that pure belief, and had a little hesitation, he would not be able to pass this hurdle. Now that he had passed it, there was nothing else. What was left was to wait patiently for the final result. After Zhang Yan left, Jiang Zheng had been sitting there. However, suddenly he felt that something was not right. He looked up and realized that there was a person standing in front of him. It was no different from him, and the strange thing was, in his senses, that person was himself. It would not be an exaggeration to say that it was his reflection. That person walked over and stopped in front of him. He said, "You don't have to worry. As you can see, I am you and you are me. This is the belly of the giant trout, and it has the ability to manipulate everything, which is why these things appear." Jiang Zheng was not moved. He said, "What does this have to do with me?" That person said, "But what if I tell you that in reality, that is you, and this is no longer you?" Jiang Zheng turned his head and saw that it was another himself sitting there. His heart trembled slightly. Just as he looked around, he saw that countless people who looked exactly like him had appeared in all directions. They were all sitting there cross-legged, and every single one of them seemed to be real. Such a scene caused one's hair to stand on end. That person said meaningfully, "The truth that you cling to might not be the truth, and the illusion that you see might not be an illusion either. I'm afraid that the one who will be rescued later will only be one of us, but it might not be you. When the time comes, you will only be separated because of this. Are you willing?" Jiang Zheng was silent for a while, then said, "Why do you have to tell me all this? My teacher helped me to enter Taoism, and it's hard for me to repay his kindness in this life. If I'm really an illusion, then there will naturally be a real body who will repay my teacher's kindness on my behalf. If that's the case, even if I'm not me, I have no regrets." At this moment, all of Jiang Zheng said in unison, "You're right. Even if I'm not me, I have no regrets." As soon as these words were spoken, all the figures vanished in unison like bubbles, and only Jiang Zheng was still sitting there. However, he was surprised to find that the place where he was sitting was no longer where he originally stood. It was as if he could no longer tell whether the person who had dispersed just now was his real self or an illusion. He smiled nonchalantly and continued to sit there steadily. In Qinghuan Palace, although Zhang Yan had come out of Muddy Sky a long time ago, He relied on the trace of karmic connection between his consciousness incarnation and his disciples to observe their every move. He was also very clear about the difficulties they had encountered. It would be good if they could rely on their own abilities to cross over, but if they couldn't, then he would naturally enter the divine will to help them in times of danger. Although doing so would very likely alarm the great trout's divine will and cause some changes in the situation. Comparing the two sides, it was clear that the lives of his disciples were more important. Right now, he was preparing for a rainy day. He couldn't give up on what was in front of him just because nothing had changed. Fortunately, his 5 disciples didn't disappoint him. As he watched, they entered the heavenly world one by one and resisted the invasion of muddy sky one after another. At this point, he had accomplished a great feat because he had found the 5 muddy sky. He was immediately able to avoid the obstruction of the whaley left behind by the predecessor and looked directly at the great trout's divine will. What the spirit refinement almighty being saw was the truth. As long as he saw it, then it was equivalent to seeing the great trout's body. With a thought, he immediately drew it out. In a flash, he saw a creature that looked like a big fish with a tail as its feet land in front of him. Although its body was infinitely large, it was still tiny in front of him. This was the fundamental difference in power. Size in a simple sense was already useless against each other. Zhang Yan glanced at it. The great trout's divine will was trembling in fear in front of him. He didn't say much. He just waved his sleeve lightly, and it dispersed like smoke. After doing this, he called out again. There was a spiritual light in the hall, and the 5 disciples returned to Qinghuan Palace. Compared to when they entered, there were some changes in each of them. It was obvious that they had obtained different degrees of benefits. Among them, Lu Yinyi was the best. Impressively, she had already entered the 2nd stage. However, even she couldn't tell whether she had broken through in the divine will or in reality. Zhang Yan could tell what she was thinking. He smiled and said, "Disciple, what you see is the truth, so it is the truth. Don't be stubborn. Being able to successfully break through is your fate." Lu Yinyi naturally believed in her master's words. The block in her heart instantly disappeared. She curtsied and said, "Thank you for your guidance, master." Zhang Yan looked at the other disciples and said, "All of you have obtained benefits this time. You may cultivate in the side hall for a while. If there is anything you don't understand, you may come to me for guidance." The 5 disciples bowed and said yes. They all retreated to the side hall. At this time, Zhang Yan sensed that with the great trout's divine will gone, the 5 muddy skies were under his control. The residual force of Bu Su Tian was also greatly reduced. It wouldn't be long before he could control this land of creation essence. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.